My name is Fiona, and I am 33 years old. I came home for Christmas expecting the usual cold shoulder. Instead, I found an empty freezing house and my 82-year-old grandfather sitting alone in the dark. A carelessly scribbled note on the kitchen counter informed me that my parents and my golden child brother had jetted off to Europe, leaving me behind as an unpaid nurse. But the real shock came when my grandfather, who had supposedly been suffering from severe dementia for months, suddenly stood up from his wheelchair, poured himself a glass of bourbon, and looked me dead in the eye. What happened over the next 7 days completely destroyed my toxic family and cost them everything they valued. Before I share my story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you believe karma always catches up with those who take family for granted. I work as a senior partner at a specialized corporate fraud investigation firm in Chicago. It is a high-stakes, demanding career where I dismantle corrupt corporations for a living, but my family has always mockingly referred to me as just a boring bookkeeper. Last Christmas Eve, I pulled my car into the sweeping circular driveway of my parents' massive estate in the northern suburbs. The property usually looked like a winter wonderland this time of year. My mother, Beverly, always hired professional decorators to drape the entire mansion in thousands of twinkling lights just to impress her country club friends. But this year, the house was completely dark. There were no holiday lights, no glowing windows, not a single sign of life from the street. I struggled through the heavy oak front door, carrying 4 heavy bags of groceries, bracing myself for the usual barrage of criticisms. I fully expected my mother to immediately comment on my weight or ask why I was not wearing designer clothes to a family dinner. Instead, the cavernous foyer was dead silent. The air inside was so bitterly cold that my breath actually plumed in front of my face in small white clouds. The thermostat had been turned completely off. I dropped the grocery bags on the freezing marble floor and called out into the darkness. Silence echoed back. Panic started to prick at the edges of my mind. I rushed past the grand staircase and into the main living room, frantically flipping on the light switch. There, sitting in a wheelchair in the absolute center of the room, wrapped tightly in a heavy wool blanket, was my grandfather, Winston. I ran over to him immediately, checking his pulse and asking if he was all right. He just stared straight ahead, his eyes vacant and cloudy, playing the role of the tragic declining patriarch my family had spent the last 6 months convincing everyone he was. I grabbed another blanket from the sofa to wrap around his frail shoulders and hurried into the kitchen to turn on the heat. That is when I saw it. Pinned to the center of the pristine marble kitchen island was a piece of personalized stationery. The note read, "Fiona, your father and I took Preston to Europe for the holidays. Preston has had an incredibly stressful quarter at the firm and desperately needs to unwind. You stay here and care for Grandpa. Do not forget his medications. There is some leftover casserole in the fridge. Do not ruin our vacation by calling with minor issues." My blood boiled instantly. Preston was my 36-year-old brother, the undisputed golden boy of the family. He had been handed a vice president title at my grandfather's international logistics empire 5 years ago, despite having absolutely zero business acumen and a track record of catastrophic financial failures. Yet somehow my parents treated his every minor inconvenience as a global crisis while treating my actual existence as an irritating burden they were forced to endure. Without thinking, I pulled out my phone and dialed my mother's number. She answered on the 4th ring, and the loud, festive background noise of clinking glasses and booming laughter immediately poured through the speaker. I demanded to know where exactly they were, my voice shaking with a mix of rage and disbelief. "Oh, Fiona, do not use that dramatic tone with me," Beverly sighed. The unmistakable sound of a Swiss ski lodge bustling behind her was deafening. "We are in St. Moritz." Preston was practically having a breakdown from managing the quarterly reports. He needed the fresh alpine air to recover, and your father wanted to treat him. "You left Grandpa alone in a freezing house on Christmas Eve," I fired back. "You did not even tell me you were leaving. I just walked in here with groceries expecting our family dinner." My mother scoffed, a sharp, condescending sound she had perfected over decades. Please, Fiona, you are 33, single, and just a corporate auditor with absolutely no social life. It is not like you had exciting holiday plans to interrupt. You can spend a few days babysitting your grandfather. It will be good for you to finally be useful to this family instead of just burying your nose in boring spreadsheets all day long. Hearing her dismiss my life so casually sent a familiar visceral flash of humiliation straight through my chest. I was immediately transported back to my college graduation day. I had graduated top of my class with a double major in finance and criminal justice. I had stood on that stage, looking out at the sea of folding chairs, desperately searching the crowd for my parents' faces. They were gone. They had left halfway through the commencement address because Preston had gotten a drunk driving charge after a frat party, and my father Richard had to rush downtown with his high-priced lawyers to bail him out. I had taken a public bus back to my empty dorm room in the pouring rain, clutching my diploma under my jacket to keep it dry. When I had called my father later that night crying, he had simply told me to stop being selfish because my brother was going through a hard time. That was the day I realized I would always be the sacrificial lamb on the altar of Preston's mistakes. I pushed the painful memory away and focused on the present reality. Mom, this is literal abandonment, I told her firmly, trying to keep my voice from breaking. Grandpa needs actual dedicated care, and you completely shut off the heat in the middle of winter. Your father turned off the thermostat to save energy before we realized how cold the forecast was, she snapped defensively. Just turn it back on and feed him the leftovers. Preston just ordered a $2,000 bottle of champagne to celebrate his new promotion, and you are ruining the mood. Do your job, Fiona, and do not call back. The line went dead with a sharp click. I stood in the massive, echoey kitchen, clutching my phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. They had done it again. They had treated me like the unpaid help, expecting me to quietly clean up their messes, while they lived in absolute luxury. I took a deep, steadying breath, resolving to make the best of it for my grandfather's sake. I walked back out into the living room to check on him, preparing a gentle, soothing voice to explain that it would just be the two of us for Christmas. But when I stepped into the room, the words died in my throat. Winston was no longer sitting slumped in the wheelchair. The heavy wool blanket lay discarded on the floor. My 82-year-old grandfather was standing by the mahogany wet bar, his posture perfectly straight, without even a hint of the frailty he had been displaying for half a year. His cane was nowhere in sight. I watched in absolute, stunned silence as he expertly unstoppered a crystal decanter and poured himself 3 fingers of neat bourbon. He took a slow, deliberate sip, letting out a satisfied sigh before turning to face me. The vacant, confused look was completely gone. His eyes were sharp, piercing, and terrifyingly lucid. "They think I am senile and dying," he said, his voice deep and steady, completely devoid of the tremor he had been faking for the last 6 months. "And they think you are a fool." He took another sip of his bourbon and set the glass down with a definitive clink against the polished wood. "Shall we begin?" I stared at the glass of bourbon in his hand, and then up at his perfectly steady gaze. My mind scrambled to process the sudden shift. Just 10 minutes ago, he was a fragile shell of a man staring blankly at a muted television screen. Now he stood with the formidable posture of the corporate titan who had built a national logistics empire from a single delivery truck. "I have been faking it, Fiona," Winston said, taking another measured sip of his drink. "Every forgotten name, every confused stare, every tremor in my hands. It has all been a performance for the last 6 months. You let them treat you like a burden?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, as the reality washed over me. "Mom talks to you like you are a toddler. Preston acts like you are already in the grave and treats your house like his personal country club." "It was the only way to make them drop their guard," Winston replied, walking over to the heavy oak dining table. He set his glass down and pulled a brass key from his pocket. "I suspected your father and your brother were quietly bleeding my company dry. They thought I was too far gone to notice the massive discrepancies in the quarterly reports. They thought they could execute their little schemes right in front of my face if I played the senile fool, but I needed hard proof and I needed a window of absolute privacy to get it without them hovering over my shoulder. He gestured around the freezing, dark living room. I orchestrated this entire Christmas scenario, Fiona. I knew Charles would use the holiday to whisk Beverly and Preston away on some lavish European vacation paid for with my money. I knew they would dump the responsibility of my care onto you because they view you as nothing more than a convenient afterthought. They think they are punishing you by leaving you behind. They do not realize they just handed me the exact person I need to tear their operation to the ground. Winston walked to the corner of the room and unlocked a heavy wooden cabinet. He pulled out a massive steel lockbox and dropped it onto the dining table with a loud thud. He popped the latches and opened the lid to reveal a chaotic stack of encrypted hard drives, flash drives, and heavily redacted financial ledgers. "Your father always loved to mock your career at family dinners," Winston said, his tone laced with absolute disgust. "He told all his country club friends that you were just a glorified bookkeeper. He laughed at you for working long hours for a supposedly meager salary while his golden boy Preston was out closing deals." I walked over to the table and looked down at the mountain of encrypted data. A cold, sharp smile spread across my face. I unzipped my travel bag and bypassed the holiday gifts I had brought, pulling out my specialized heavy-duty decryption laptop. It was military-grade hardware, encased in reinforced titanium, completely untraceable, and packed with proprietary software that my firm used to crack offshore banking networks. They only think I am a bookkeeper because they never actually cared enough to ask me what I do, I told him, booting up the machine. The screen cast a stark blue glow across the dark room. "I am a senior partner at Vance & Sterling. It is an elite forensic accounting firm in downtown Chicago. I do not balance checkbooks, Grandpa. I dismantle corrupt corporate structures. Just last month I tracked $50 million in stolen assets across 3 continents and put a corrupt CEO in federal prison. I tear apart fraudulent empires brick by brick, and I enjoy it." Winston smiled, and the sheer pride in his eyes was something I had not seen directed at me in over a decade. "I know exactly what you do, Fiona. That is why I made sure you were the one left behind to babysit me." I plugged a multi-port adapter into my laptop and began sorting through the hard drives. "Where did you get these?" I asked. "I managed to slip into Charles' office during Thanksgiving dinner while they were all busy drinking wine and toasting to Preston's fake success," Winston explained. "I copied what I could from the secondary servers. These drives contain the routed transactions, but they are heavily encrypted. And worse, they are incomplete." I tapped a few keys, initiating a brute force decryption protocol on the first drive. "What are we missing?" I asked, watching the lines of code race across my screen. The master ledger, Winston stated, his expression darkening. "Your father is arrogant, but he is not entirely stupid. He keeps the primary ledger detailing every stolen cent, every fake invoice, and every offshore account completely disconnected from the main company network. It is stored on a localized physical drive locked inside his biometric wall safe in the master study upstairs." I paused my typing and looked up at him. "You cannot access it." Winston shook his head. "He changed the security protocols 3 months ago. He removed my fingerprints from the system authorization entirely. The safe requires a specific biometric scan and a localized PIN code. If I try to force it open, or if I input the wrong code 3 times, it triggers a digital failsafe. It will initiate an electromagnetic pulse that completely fries the hard drive inside. We get one shot at this, Fiona. If we trip that failsafe, the proof is gone forever, and Charles will know I am onto him. He will liquidate everything and run before I can stop him." I closed my laptop, grabbed my bag of cables, and started walking toward the grand staircase. Then we better not trip it. We moved up the stairs in silence, the freezing temperature of the house matching the ice-cold focus settling over my mind. We entered the master study, a room I had always hated. It smelled of expensive cigars and unearned arrogance. The walls were lined with photos of Charles shaking hands with politicians and massive framed portraits of Preston holding various meaningless awards Charles had bought for him. There was not a single picture of me in the entire room. Winston moved a large oil painting aside to reveal the heavy steel face of the biometric wall safe. A sleek black digital keypad glowed ominously next to the fingerprint scanner. I set my laptop down on Charles' massive mahogany desk and pulled out a specialized bypass terminal. It was a small black device covered in interface cables used specifically by my firm for accessing hostile hardware during corporate raids. I plugged one end into my laptop and carefully connected the interface clips to the exposed data port beneath the safe's keypad. "Can you bypass the fingerprint scanner?" Winston asked, standing close behind me. "The scanner is just the physical gateway," I explained, my fingers flying across my keyboard as I ran a diagnostic on the safe's internal firewall. The actual locking mechanism is controlled by a dual authentication logic board. I can spoof the biometric feedback loop using a thermal bypass program to make the safe think a registered finger is on the glass, but that only unlocks the first gate. I pointed to the digital keypad, which was now displaying a flashing red prompt demanding a 6-digit code. "The failsafe is tied to this keypad," I told him. "If I try to run a randomized codebreaker program, the internal processor will detect the unnatural speed of the inputs and trigger the wipe. It requires a manual human input. We need the exact 6-digit PIN." Winston sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly. "Charles never writes anything down. He is too paranoid. We could guess 1,000 combinations and never hit the right one." I stared at the blinking red cursor on my screen. Action-based memories flooded my mind. I thought about how my father operated. I thought about the towering portrait of Preston hanging directly over the desk. I thought about how Charles viewed the world entirely through the lens of his own ego and his obsession with his golden boy. He was paranoid, yes, but he was also incredibly vain and utterly predictable. People like Charles did not use randomized security codes. They used numbers that made them feel powerful, numbers they believed defined their legacy and cemented their dynasty. "He is arrogant," I said softly, my eyes locking onto the flashing red light of the keypad. "Arrogant men always leave a signature because they think they are untouchable." He views Preston as his ultimate achievement. The day Preston was born was the day Charles finally got the male heir he desperately wanted to hand the company over to. It is the only day he truly cares about. I picked up the bypass terminal, preparing to manually input the numbers. I was risking everything on my understanding of my father's toxic psychology. If I was wrong, the drive would fry, and our only chance to save the company would be reduced to ash. I connected the final wire, watching the firewall interface light up green on my laptop screen, indicating the biometric spoof was successful. The keypad beeped, waiting for the final code. My heart hammered against my ribs, but my hands remained perfectly steady. "Let us see just how predictable my father really is," I said. My fingers hovered over the sleek black keypad of the biometric safe. A brute force attack would trigger the failsafe, immediately locking us out forever. I had to think exactly like Charles. I closed my eyes and pictured the man who had spent my entire life making me feel invisible. I had to inhabit his mind, understand his narcissism, and leverage his absolute obsession with his golden boy. What were the numbers he held sacred? It certainly would not be my birthday or my mother's anniversary. I typed in the 4 digits of the year he founded his logistics company, followed by the day and month he legally incorporated it. The screen flashed a sharp yellow warning: "Access denied. 2 attempts remaining." Winston shifted nervously behind me, his breathing shallow in the freezing room, but I held up a hand to keep him quiet. I knew the pattern. The company was his first child, but Preston was his living, breathing legacy. I cleared the screen. I typed in Preston's exact birth date, followed by the last 4 digits of Preston's social security number. These were the digits Charles used on every single combination lock during my childhood, from his golf club locker to his private wine cellar. He viewed Preston as his ultimate achievement, his male heir. I held my breath and pressed the pound key. A heavy mechanical clunk echoed through the silent study. The thick steel bolts retracted, and the heavy door swung open on perfectly oiled hinges. Winston exhaled a sharp breath of disbelief. "You cracked it," he whispered, staring at the dark cavity in the wall. I did not crack it, I replied, pulling the heavy door open the rest of the way. I just know exactly who my father loves, and it has never been us. I reached into the safe. The master ledger was right where Winston said it would be. A thick, leather-bound book resting on top of a stack of encrypted hard drives and bundles of cash. I pulled the ledger out and set it on the desk next to my laptop. But as I reached back in to grab the drives, my fingers brushed against thick paper. Tucked away in the very back, hidden underneath a velvet jewelry box, was a heavy manila folder. I pulled it into the light of the desk lamp. Typed neatly on the tab was my full name, Fiona Beverly Sterling. My brow furrowed. Charles never kept anything related to me in his private sanctuary. I opened the flap and pulled out a stack of heavily stamped bank statements and legal documents. The header on the first page made my blood run absolutely cold. It was a declaration of an irrevocable trust fund. The founding date was exactly 20 years ago. The primary benefactor was Winston, and the sole beneficiary was me. Grandpa, what is this? I asked, my voice barely a whisper in the quiet room. Winston wheeled his chair closer, pulling his reading glasses from his pocket. He squinted at the documents, and his face instantly drained of all color. I set that up for you when you were 13, he said, his voice shaking with a mix of shock and rising fury. It was meant to cover your entire college education, your first home, and a safety net for your future. I put $4 million into that account, Fiona. Charles and Beverly were designated as the custodians until you turned 25. They told me you received every penny. They told me you used it to pay for your elite accounting degree and that you lost the rest in a terrible real estate investment straight out of college. I stared at the paperwork, tracing the lines of transactions with a trembling finger. I had paid for my degree by working double shifts at a diner and taking out predatory student loans that took me nearly a decade to pay off. I spent my 20s living in a roach-infested apartment, eating cheap noodles and dodging collection calls while my family took luxury ski trips to Aspen. My parents had told me the company was going through a rough patch, and they simply could not afford to help me with tuition. They told me it builds character to struggle, and that I needed to learn the value of a dollar. I flipped to the transaction history from the year I turned 22. That was the exact same year Preston was involved in a massive multi-car collision while driving his sports car under the influence. He had severely injured 2 people, and the victims' families sued him for everything he had. I vividly remember the hushed, panicked arguments in the house. I remember the sudden out-of-court settlement that made the whole nightmare magically disappear from the public record. Now, looking at the bank statements, the horrifying truth was staring me right in the face. On the exact week of Preston's settlement, $2.5 million was wired directly out of my trust fund to a private legal escrow account. Over the next 6 months, they completely drained the remaining balance to zero, using the last of my money to buy Preston a new luxury condo downtown, to help him get a fresh start after his ordeal. They stole my future to pave over his crimes. They watched me drown in debt and told me I was not working hard enough, all while spending the millions my grandfather had gifted me to protect their golden boy from federal prison. A surge of intense, blinding anger hit me so hard it felt entirely physical. The room spun for a fraction of a second. Decades of feeling inadequate, decades of exhaustion and financial terror, and listening to them praise Preston for his resilience. It was all built on a foundation of my stolen money. My mother had looked me in the eye and told me I was a disappointment while she was actively signing away my financial security. The tears pricked at the corners of my eyes, hot and demanding, but I absolutely refused to let them fall. I took a deep, ragged breath and forced the emotion down deep into the pit of my stomach, locking it away. Crying was for victims, and I was officially done being a victim. I did not break down. I took every ounce of that grief and profound betrayal and weaponized it into pure, terrifying strategic focus. Winston reached out and placed a trembling hand on my arm. Fiona, I swear to you by all that is holy, I did not know. I thought you had squandered it. I thought you resented me for putting restrictive terms on the trust. I never would have allowed this. It is okay, Grandpa, I said, my voice dropping to a low, icy calm that surprised even me. The girl who would have cried over this, died a long time ago. Now I am just the auditor. And the auditor is about to balance the scales. I tossed the empty trust folder aside, letting it scatter across the floor. It was dead weight now. I turned my attention entirely to the master ledger. I opened the heavy leather-bound book. Charles was old school. He kept digital records for the IRS, but the true unfalsified numbers were written here in his own meticulous handwriting. He detailed every shell company, every offshore kickback, every phantom invoice he and Preston had used to siphon cash from the logistics empire. I quickly booted up my forensic modeling software, scanning the written pages through my laptop camera, and letting the optical recognition program digitize the data in real time. Numbers flashed across my screen, building a massive, complex web of financial deceit. I had seen corporate greed before in my line of work, but the sheer audacity of my father and brother was staggering. They were bleeding the company dry by creating fake vendors, paying millions for consulting services that never existed, and routing the cash through untraceable accounts in the Cayman Islands. They were funding Preston's failing real estate ventures entirely with stolen corporate capital. But as my software compiled the data from the last 3 months, a massive red flag triggered on my dashboard. It was not a withdrawal. It was an incoming cash injection. A massive one. $15 million deposited directly into the main corporate holding account, originating from a highly aggressive private equity firm known for predatory lending and hostile takeovers. I leaned closer to the screen, my eyes scanning the corresponding collateral documents attached to the loan file. They had not used the company trucks or the commercial warehouses to secure the money. The collateral did not match the business assets at all. I clicked open the scanned PDF of the original loan contract. My heart stopped. I read the signature line, then I read the property description. The blood drained from my face completely. The numbers on the screen blurred together as the full catastrophic reality of what Preston and Charles had done finally clicked into place. This was not just a simple embezzlement scheme anymore. This was a death sentence for our entire family legacy. "Grandpa?" I said, my voice turning to absolute ice as I slowly turned the laptop screen toward him. "They aren't just embezzling. Preston used this estate and forged your signature as collateral for a massive private loan." I typed the final digit into the bypass terminal. Instead of launching a brute force attack that would immediately trigger the digital failsafe of my father and fry the hard drives inside the safe, I relied entirely on my deep understanding of his toxic psychology. I input the exact date of birth of my brother Preston, followed by his social security number and the founding date of the logistics company. It was a sequence of numbers that represented everything Charles valued in this world. It was a legacy he intended to pass exclusively to his golden child. A heavy mechanical clunk echoed through the freezing master study. The thick steel bolts retracted smoothly, and the heavy safe door swung open on its perfectly oiled hinges. Inside, sitting neatly beside the leather-bound master ledger, was a secondary hidden folder. I pulled it out and felt my breath catch in my throat. My full name was typed sharply across the manila tab. I opened the flap and pulled out a thick stack of bank statements and legal declarations. It was a multi-million-dollar trust fund that Winston had set up for my education and future exactly 20 years ago. The transaction history showed that when I turned 22, Charles and Beverly had illegally drained the entire account. They had forged custodial signatures and transferred every single penny to quietly settle a massive civil lawsuit Preston had caused after a reckless driving incident. They had stolen my future, forced me into crippling student debt, and mocked my career choices, all to protect their precious son from federal prison. A surge of intense, blinding anger hit me so hard it felt physical. The room spun for a fraction of a second, but I refused to break down. Crying was for victims, and I was officially done being a victim. I weaponized my grief, channeling every ounce of that profound betrayal into pure strategic focus. I grabbed the master ledger and the encrypted drives. We set up a forensic war room downstairs in the massive formal dining room. I pushed aside the opulent silver centerpieces my mother prized so highly and covered the polished mahogany table with the stolen documents. I connected two portable monitors from my travel bag to my decryption laptop, creating a massive digital command center right where we usually ate dry forced holiday meals. Winston sat at the head of the table, watching me work with a quiet, burning intensity. We ran financial diagnostics through the entire night, tracing a complex web of shell companies and offshore accounts hidden in the Cayman Islands and the Isle of Man. As I cross-referenced the offshore wire transfers with public business records, the illusion of the success of my brother completely shattered. The highly praised real estate empire Preston loved to brag about was nothing more than a collapsing Ponzi scheme. He was not a visionary developer. He was using the capital from new investors to pay off the exorbitant returns he had promised his initial backers. He had been buying useless plots of commercial land and inflating their value with bogus appraisals to secure even more investor cash. The properties themselves were heavily leveraged and practically worthless on paper. When his well of new investors started to dry up 6 months ago, the entire scheme had threatened to implode and send him to prison. To keep himself afloat and maintain his lavish lifestyle, Preston had panicked. He had turned to the family logistics company, using it as his own personal slush fund. He and Charles had been siphoning millions from the operating budget, faking heavy equipment purchases, and inflating vendor invoices to cover the cash leaving the company. They were bleeding the life work of my grandfather to death just to prop up a massive lie. Suddenly, my main screen flashed a blinding warning in bright crimson. A blaring digital alarm shattered the silence of the dining room. An automated voice announced that an unauthorized access protocol was initiated and a remote wipe sequence was engaged. My heart slammed against my ribs. I practically threw myself at the keyboard. Someone had tripped a silent digital tripwire when I downloaded the final ledger file. I traced the internet protocol address instantly. It was bouncing through a proxy server, but the origin point was unmistakable. It was coming from a high-end ski resort in St. Moritz, Switzerland. "The executive assistant of my father is monitoring the servers remotely," I yelled, my fingers flying across the keys with frantic precision. "He detected the intrusion, and he is trying to format the entire financial database to destroy the evidence." Winston gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white, but he stayed completely silent, letting me work. This was a real-time cyber standoff, and the assistant of my father was aggressive. He deployed a data-shredding worm designed to overwrite the hard drives with junk data, permanently incinerating the digital trail connecting the shell companies to Preston. But he was just an executive assistant playing with standard corporate security tools. I was a senior partner at a firm that regularly fought off state-sponsored hackers. I launched the proprietary counter-intrusion software of my firm. It was a program specifically designed to trap and isolate hostile malware. I watched the progress bar on my screen as my software intercepted his data-shredding worm and quarantined it inside a digital sandbox. Then I went on the offensive. I bypassed his proxy server, hit his remote access terminal with a denial of service protocol, and completely locked him out of the main company network. The red warning screens on my laptop instantly vanished, replaced by a solid green banner. I initiated a forced download, stripping every remaining byte of financial data from the servers and securing it locally on my encrypted drive. "Got him!" I exhaled, leaning back in my chair and wiping a bead of sweat from my forehead. "The data is secured, and he is permanently locked out. They are flying blind now." Winston let out a breath he had been holding. "You are terrifyingly good at this, Fiona." I turned my attention back to the final folder I had pulled from the server right before the lockdown. It contained the unredacted documents for a massive private loan I had discovered earlier in the physical ledger. I opened the document and began reading the brutal terms of the contract. The color drained from my face faster than it had when I found my stolen trust fund. The numbers on the screen blurred together as the full catastrophic reality of what Preston and Charles had done finally clicked into place. This was not just a simple embezzlement scheme anymore. This was a death sentence for our entire family legacy. "Grandpa?" I said, my voice turning to absolute ice as I slowly turned the laptop screen toward him. They aren't just embezzling. Preston used this estate and forged your signature as collateral for a massive private loan. We have a balloon payment document right here. A ruthless private equity lender is owed $15 million, and the deadline for the payment is New Year's Eve. If it isn't paid by midnight, they lose the company, and we lose the estate. Winston stared at the screen, the blue light reflecting in his wide, horrified eyes. $15 million, he repeated, his voice barely a rasp in the freezing room. By New Year's Eve, that is exactly 6 days from now. I nodded, my fingers flying back over the keyboard to pull up the accompanying legal documentation. And they did not just sign a standard corporate promissory note. Look at this. I clicked on a high-resolution scan of the signature page. This is a full legal binding of your personal assets. The company fleet, the commercial warehouses, and this very house. They bundled it all into one massive collateral package. Winston leaned in close, examining the ink strokes on the digital document. I never signed that. I have not signed a major financial authorization in over a year. I know you didn't, I said, zooming in on the notary seal. Because this signature is a complete forgery, and a sloppy one at that. Preston never had the patience for details. I opened a split screen, bringing up a legitimate contract Winston had signed 5 years ago, right next to the forged loan document. I pointed to the loops of the cursive handwriting. Look at the tension in the downstroke of the W. It is hesitant. Whoever signed this was tracing moving entirely too slowly. And look at the date. They executed this transfer of power of attorney 3 months ago. Right around the time they started telling everyone your memory was fading and you were becoming confused. Winston slammed his fist against the mahogany table, making the monitors rattle. They fabricated my decline to justify why I wasn't present at the legal signings. They told the bankers I was too frail to travel, so they had to handle the transactions as my designated proxies. Exactly, I replied. It is a textbook elder abuse fraud structure. But Charles made one fatal error. I pulled up the metadata of the forged PDF. He underestimated me. A vivid memory flashed through my mind. I was 25, sitting at this exact dining room table, proudly announcing my promotion at the accounting firm. Charles had barely looked up from his medium-rare steak. He had waved his silver steak knife at me and laughed, telling Preston that Fiona was destined to be a glorified bean counter. He said numbers were for people who lacked the vision to actually build things. He called my profession a service industry for real men of action. His absolute disdain for my intelligence was the greatest gift he ever gave me. Because he thought my job was nothing more than basic addition and subtraction, he never bothered to learn what a forensic auditor actually does. He never realized I possessed the exact digital weaponry required to tear his entire life apart. Because Charles thinks he is the smartest man in any room, he is incredibly lazy with his digital security. I explained to Winston launching a password breach protocol on Charles's private email server. He uses the same encryption key for his personal communications that he uses for his country club account. A man of action does not waste time on complex cybersecurity. The progress bar on my screen filled in seconds. The firewall shattered, and Charles's private inbox flooded my screen. Let us see what they are really doing in Switzerland, I said, filtering the messages by the highest priority tags. I clicked on a thread that had been active just 3 hours ago. The subject line read simply, Project Liquidation Final Phase. The recipients were Charles Beverly and Preston. I began reading the emails aloud, my voice echoing in the freezing room. The narrative my mother had fed me on the phone just hours ago completely evaporated into thin air. They were not in St. Moritz sipping champagne and hitting the ski slopes. The GPS routing data on the emails showed they were in Zurich, sitting in a boardroom at a private wealth management bank. They are finalizing a total asset liquidation, I told Winston, scanning the attachments. Charles has bundled the remaining healthy contracts of your logistics company and sold them to a European competitor for pennies on the dollar. He is taking the cash from the sale, combining it with the money they embezzled, and moving it all into an untraceable offshore trust in the Cayman Islands. Winston gripped the padded arms of his wheelchair. and the $15 million loan. They are going to default, I said, feeling a cold, heavy knot form in my stomach as I read their timeline. The balloon payment is due on December 31st. They have zero intention of paying it. They are going to let the private equity firm foreclose on everything. The lender seizes the company and this estate to cover the debt, and Charles and Preston walk away with tens of millions of dollars in clean, untraceable cash hidden overseas. They are leaving me to take the fall, Winston whispered, the betrayal carving deep lines into his weathered face. They are going to let me lose the home I built for my wife, the company I bled for. They are going to leave me penniless and disgraced. They are trying, I corrected him sharply, but they are not going to succeed, not while I am sitting at this table. I dug deeper into the inbox, searching for the exact account numbers of the offshore trust. I needed the routing codes to freeze their assets before they could finalize the transfers. But as I scrolled past the banking correspondence, a separate email thread caught my eye. It was flagged with a high-priority red marker, but the sender was not a banker or a corporate lawyer. The sender address belonged to a prominent private psychiatric clinic in upstate New York. I clicked on the thread. The first message was from Charles to a Dr. Eris Thorne. "What is it?" Winston asked, noticing the sudden rigid tension in my shoulders. "Fiona, what did you find?" I did not answer right away. I could not. The words on the screen were so horrifically evil that my brain struggled to process them as reality. I had known my family was greedy. I had known they were selfish and legally corrupt. But I had never truly grasped the sheer depths of their depravity until this exact second. "Grandpa," I said, my voice barely more than a dry rasp. I scrolled down to the attached document in the email. It was a drafted medical certificate bearing Winston's name, his date of birth, and a comprehensive, entirely fabricated psychiatric evaluation. I froze my eyes, locked on the final paragraph of the doctor's assessment. The room around me seemed to drop another 10 degrees. My hands hovered over the keyboard, completely paralyzed by the sheer, monstrous reality of what my father was planning to do. I read the words of the medical certificate again, forcing myself to absorb the clinical, detached language. Dr. Eris Thorne described Winston as exhibiting severe, rapid-onset cognitive decline, prone to violent outbursts, and entirely incapable of managing his own physical or financial well-being. The document authorized an immediate involuntary committal to the Oak Ridge Psychiatric Institute. I knew Oak Ridge. It was a bleak state-run facility notorious for being a heavily medicated dumping ground for unwanted elderly wards. It was a place where people went to disappear and never come back. Charles was not just a thief, he was a monster. He was planning to lock his own father in a nightmare just to cover his financial tracks. I clicked on a reply from my mother. Beverly had actually chimed in on the email chain to complain about the exorbitant consulting fee of Dr. Thorne. She haggled over the cost of the medical bribe, ultimately agreeing that it was a necessary expense to avoid paying off the $15 million private equity loan. I read the emails out loud to Winston, my voice shaking with a rage so visceral it made my teeth ache. Charles had the timeline mapped out with terrifying precision. He and Beverly were scheduled to fly back from Zurich on the morning of New Year's Eve. They planned to walk through the front door of this estate at exactly 4 o'clock in the afternoon, flanked by private medical contractors. They were going to drag Winston out of his own home under the guise of an emergency psychiatric hold. By legally declaring him incompetent, Charles would automatically trigger the medical proxy and durable power of attorney clauses he had already slipped into the forged loan documents. With Winston out of the way, Charles would gain absolute total control over every single asset. He could approve the liquidation of the company default on the aggressive private equity loan and walk away with the embezzled offshore millions. Winston would rot in a state facility, stripped of his phone and his rights, completely unable to contact a lawyer or fight back. I expected Winston to collapse. I expected the sheer weight of his own son's betrayal to break whatever spirit he had left. I turned my chair around, half preparing to catch him. But the man looking over my shoulder was not a victim. The slight practiced tremor in his hands was completely gone. His posture was rigid, his jaw locked tight. The fire in his eyes burned so bright it banished the freezing chill of the dining room. "They want to play God with my life and my company?" Winston growled. His voice did not shake. It resonated with the terrifying, unyielding authority of a man who had built a national empire from the dirt up. "Burn them to the ground, Fiona. Every last one of them." I turned back to the glowing monitors, a cold smile touching my lips. Gladly. I cracked my knuckles and launched a deep web extraction protocol. If my father wanted to play a game of legal leverage, we were going to rewrite the entire rulebook. I started downloading every single email, transferring the encrypted offshore routing numbers, and copying the fraudulent medical certificate. This was no longer just a corporate audit to save a logistics company. It was a criminal investigation into elder abuse, fraud, and extortion. I thought about all of the times Charles had publicly belittled my career. He had told his country club friends that I was just a human calculator, a girl who stamped receipts for a living while Preston was out closing real estate deals. His supreme arrogance had perfectly blinded him to the reality of modern forensic accounting. I was not just balancing his checkbook. I was tracing his digital footprints, mapping his proxy servers, and building an airtight federal indictment right under his nose. By assuming I was stupid, he had handed me the exact weapon I needed to dismantle his entire life. "We need to move the clean capital immediately," I told Winston, my fingers flying across the keyboard. "The $15 million balloon payment triggers in exactly 6 days. If we drain the primary holding accounts and transfer your legitimate personal assets into an airtight blind trust, Charles will be left holding an empty bag. When the private equity firm comes to collect their collateral, they will find absolute zero liquidity." "Can you authorize a mass transfer without triggering a notification to Charles in Zurich?" Winston asked, watching the complex lines of code cascade down my monitor. "I already locked his executive assistant out of the mainframe. I explained initiating a secondary bypass. Now I am establishing a ghost server. It creates a mirrored synthetic loop of the company's financial state. When Charles logs in from his luxury ski lodge, he will see exactly what he wants to see. He will see a fat, healthy account ready to be liquidated. He will not realize the money is already gone until the federal agents are putting him in handcuffs." The digital transfer required immense processing power. The dual monitors cast a harsh, stark blue glow across the opulent dining room, illuminating the heavy silver centerpieces and the crystal chandeliers my mother prized so highly. We were sitting in the heart of a stolen empire, slowly draining its lifeblood back into the hands of its rightful owner. I hit the final execution command, initiating the mass transfer of Winston's personal wealth and the company's remaining clean operating capital into a newly formed, heavily encrypted trust. The progress bar on my screen inched forward, agonizingly slow. 10%, 20%. While the transfer processed, I pulled up the rest of the emails from Beverly. My mother had actually sent a follow-up message to the corrupt doctor, complaining that the psychiatric facility did not allow patients to bring their own personal clothing. She was severely annoyed because she had just bought Winston a cheap set of pajamas for Christmas to maintain appearances, and she didn't want the money to go to waste. The absolute callousness was suffocating. She was actively planning to commit her father-in-law to a state asylum, and her biggest concern was a $30 pair of polyester pajamas, 50%. The wind outside began to howl, rattling the tall leaded window panes of the formal dining room. The massive old house creaked, settling against the bitter winter cold. We were entirely alone. The household staff had been given the entire week off by Charles to ensure total privacy for his New Year's Eve ambush. We were supposed to be sitting ducks, completely isolated and waiting for the slaughter. "He always was a coward," Winston said softly, his eyes fixed intensely on the progress bar. "Charles never could look a man in the eye when he bested him. He always preferred the knife in the back. I spent my whole life trying to teach him how to build, how to create value through hard work. I should have been teaching you." I felt a tight, painful knot in my chest finally unravel at his words. For 30 years I had desperately craved validation from this family. I had worked myself to the bone chasing an impossible standard set by a mother who despised my independence and a father who ignored my existence. And now the only person whose respect actually mattered was sitting beside me, treating me like a true equal. "We are going to take it all back, Grandpa," I promised him, my voice fierce and steady. "By the time Charles lands in Chicago, he won't have a single penny to his name. 90%. The transfer was almost complete. The digital vault was sealing, preparing to shut Charles and Preston out of the logistics empire forever. I reached for my cold cup of coffee, feeling a triumphant smile spread across my face. As the progress bar hit 99%, suddenly a heavy, aggressive pounding echoed from the massive oak front door, shattering the quiet of the estate. The heavy, aggressive pounding echoed from the massive oak front door, shattering the quiet of the estate. The sheer force of the blows rattled the crystal chandelier hanging above our makeshift war room. Someone was trying to break the door off its hinges. Winston did not flinch. He sat perfectly still in his wheelchair, his eyes locked on the digital progress bar on my monitor as it finally ticked over to 100%. The screen flashed a solid green confirmation. The mass transfer of the company operating capital and his personal wealth into the encrypted blind trust was completely finalized. The money was safe, but the threat was already standing on our doorstep. I closed the laptop with a sharp snap and slid the master ledger underneath it. "Stay right here, Grandpa," I said, my voice entirely devoid of panic. "Let me see who Charles sent to do his dirty work." I walked out of the formal dining room and crossed the freezing marble floor of the grand foyer. The pounding continued, relentless and rhythmic, echoing through the empty halls of the mansion. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the heavy door open. A blast of bitter winter wind rushed inside, carrying the sharp sting of impending snow. Standing on the threshold was a man who looked like he had been engineered in a corporate laboratory designed specifically to intimidate. He wore a tailored camel hair overcoat over a dark bespoke suit and a silk tie perfectly knotted at his throat. His face was sharp, his jaw clenched, and his eyes were completely dead, like chunks of wet coal. He radiated an aura of absolute, ruthless, predatory entitlement. Flanking him on either side were two massive private security contractors. They were dressed in tactical winter gear, their postures wide, and their hands resting casually near their holstered weapons. "Where is Charles Sterling?" the man demanded, his voice carrying a harsh, gravelly edge that cut right through the howling wind. "He is currently unavailable," I replied, standing squarely in the center of the doorway. "The estate is closed to visitors. I will have to ask you to leave." The man let out a short, abrasive bark of a laugh. He did not ask for permission. He stepped forward, dropping his shoulder, and physically shoved his way past me. His heavy shoulder caught my collarbone, forcing me to stumble back a step against the cold marble wall. The two security contractors immediately followed him inside, tracking wet snow and slush across the pristine foyer floor. "Get out of the way," he sneered, not even bothering to look back at me. "I am not going to stand out in the freezing cold negotiating with the house help. I am here to collect, and I am not leaving until I get what I came for." He strode purposefully down the hall, moving with the arrogant familiarity of a man who believed he already owned everything he looked at. He headed straight for the soft blue light spilling out of the formal dining room. I recovered my balance instantly. The physical shove did not scare me. It simply confirmed exactly what kind of animal I was dealing with. I followed him into the dining room, my footsteps completely silent against the floorboards. The man stopped at the head of the long mahogany table. His dead eyes locked onto Winston. He took in the sight of my grandfather sitting in his wheelchair wrapped in a heavy wool blanket. Then he looked at the dual monitors, the tangle of cables, and the specialized decryption equipment scattered across the antique wood. A smug, ugly smirk stretched across his face. "So the rumors are entirely false," the man said, his tone dripping with condescension. "Charles told me the great Winston Sterling was drooling in a cup and talking to the walls. He swore to me you were completely incapacitated. Yet here you are holding court in the dark." "I am entirely lucid," Mr. Vance Winston replied, his voice carrying the deep, unyielding resonance of a king addressing a trespasser. He did not raise his voice, but the sheer authority in his tone made the two security guards shift uncomfortably on their feet. "And I suggest you remove yourself from my home before I have you arrested for breaking and entering." Elias Vance laughed again and reached inside his tailored overcoat. He pulled out a thick legal document bound in heavy blue paper. He tossed it onto the polished mahogany table, letting it slide until it hit the edge of my laptop. "I am not trespassing, Winston," Elias said, leaning his knuckles against the table and hovering over my grandfather. "I am inspecting my property. My name is Elias Vance. I am the senior managing partner of Vanguard Equity. 3 months ago, your incredibly desperate son and your idiot grandson came to my office begging for a lifeline. They leveraged this entire estate, your commercial trucking fleet, and the main logistics warehouses to secure a $15 million private equity loan." Elias tapped the blue document with a manicured finger. "That is the formal notice of foreclosure. The balloon payment triggers at exactly midnight on New Year's Eve. Charles stopped answering my calls yesterday, and the tracking data on his private jet shows he fled to Switzerland. They took the cash and ran Winston. They left you holding the bag. If that $15 million is not wired into my holding account by midnight on December 31st, I am going to have the sheriff change the locks on these doors. I am going to have my men physically drag you out of this wheelchair and throw you into the snow. I own you." I stood near the archway of the dining room watching Elias Vance try to break my grandfather. As I listened to him threaten to throw an old man into the street, a vivid, visceral memory flooded my mind. I was 23 years old, standing in the doorway of a damp, roach-infested apartment on the south side of Chicago. A sleazy, aggressive landlord was pounding his fists against my door, screaming that he was going to throw my belongings into the alley over $300 in late rent. I had used my last dime to pay for my advanced accounting textbooks. Terrified and alone, I had called Charles begging for a tiny micro-loan just to keep a roof over my head while I finished my finals. Charles had answered the phone from his private suite at the country club. He told me that the real world was full of wolves and that predators only eat the weak. He told me to figure it out, and then he hung up on me. I had been forced to face that aggressive landlord entirely alone. I had stood in that doorway, terrified but unbroken, and negotiated a payment plan while working a third job mopping floors at night, just to survive. My family had deliberately left me to be devoured by the wolves. But looking at Elias Vance towering over my grandfather, I realized the absolute irony of my life. Charles and Preston loved to act like apex predators, but the second a real wolf showed up at their door, they forged documents, stole money, and fled the continent. They were cowards. They had shielded themselves with stolen wealth their entire lives. But I had learned how to fight in the dark. I had learned how to stare down monsters because my family had abandoned me to them. Elias was still talking, his voice rising in volume as he tried to elicit a reaction of fear from Winston. "You are going to liquidate whatever personal accounts you have left," Old Man Elias sneered. "You are going to sign the deed over to me right now, and maybe I will let you keep enough cash to pay for a cheap nursing home." One of the security contractors stepped forward, reaching a heavy hand toward my decryption laptop. "Check these computers," he grunted to his partner. "See what they are doing." "Do not touch that machine," I said, my voice slicing through the room like a physical blade. The contractor froze, startled by the absolute venom in my tone. Elias turned around, finally looking at me properly. He looked me up and down, taking in my simple clothes and my messy hair. "I told you to wait in the hall," Elias snapped, waving his hand dismissively. "Go fetch us some coffee, sweetheart. The adults are talking business." I did not move toward the kitchen. I walked deliberately around the heavy oak chairs, closing the distance until I was standing directly across the mahogany table from Elias. The two security contractors tensed up, but I ignored them entirely. I reached down and picked up the blue foreclosure notice. I did not just look at the paper, I visually dissected it. In 3 seconds, I processed the predatory interest rates, the accelerated default clauses, and the fraudulent notary stamps that Charles had used to execute the transaction. It was an aggressive, hostile contract designed specifically to trap a desperate victim. It was the exact kind of financial weapon I dismantled every single day for a living. I tossed the document back onto the table, letting it land directly in front of Elias. I crossed my arms and leveled a stare at him that carried all the cold, calculated fury I had spent the last decade perfecting. I let the silence stretch, forcing him to endure the weight of my gaze until his smug smirk finally began to falter. "You're standing in my house, Mr. Vance, and you're about to make the biggest mistake of your career." I did not wait for Elias to formulate a response to my threat. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my phone, and raised it directly level with his face. The camera flash blinded him for a split second, casting sharp, unnatural shadows against the antique mahogany walls of the dining room. "What the hell are you doing?" Elias barked, raising a hand to shield his eyes. The two massive security contractors instantly stepped forward, their heavy boots thudding against the floorboards. I did not flinch. I did not even look at them. I kept my eyes locked entirely on Elias. "I am doing my job," I replied, my thumbs flying across the digital keyboard. "I am uploading your biometric data into my firm's proprietary background database. As a senior forensic auditor for one of the largest financial institutions in the country, I have unrestricted Tier 1 access to Federal Registry's offshore banking ledgers and global corporate filings." Elias let out a harsh, dismissive scoff. "You think a quick background check scares me, little girl? I own half the private equity in this city. You are wasting your time. You have until midnight tomorrow to vacate this property, or my men will physically throw you out." I ignored his blustering, keeping my focus entirely on the loading screen. The progress circle spun rapidly, pinging against international servers. This was the moment I had trained for my entire adult life. Charles and Preston had always treated my profession as a glorified secretarial role. They genuinely believed accounting was just basic addition and subtraction. They never understood the sheer terrifying power of absolute financial transparency. They never realized that in the modern digital age, a forensic auditor is the ultimate apex predator. The phone chimed a sharp, crisp sound that echoed in the quiet dining room. Exactly 60 seconds had passed. "Let us see who you really are, Mr. Vance," I said, looking down at the screen. My eyes scanned the dense blocks of data, filtering the information with practiced, lethal efficiency. "I see a primary residence in Chicago and a corporate headquarters downtown. Very standard. But your shell companies are much more interesting. You have 3 unregistered LLCs operating out of Cyprus. You have a blind trust in the Cayman Islands that you failed to declare on your domestic tax filings for the last 5 consecutive years." Elias went completely rigid. The arrogant sneer vanished from his face, replaced by a sudden stark mask of tension. "And here is the real problem." I continued, my voice dropping into a cold, conversational tone that was far more intimidating than any shouting match. "I am looking at your wire transfers. Specifically, I am looking at a series of massive, unrecorded capital injections moving from a bank in Macau directly into your Vanguard equity holding accounts. You are leveraging dirty, untaxed offshore cash to fund your domestic private equity loans. You are essentially operating a high-end money laundering syndicate right under the nose of the federal government." "Shut your mouth," Elias snarled, taking a heavy, threatening step toward me. "That is proprietary corporate data. You have no idea what you are looking at." I stepped right into his space, closing the gap until we were inches apart. I matched his aggression with absolute icy precision. "I know exactly what I am looking at." I fired back, my voice ringing with absolute authority. "I am looking at 10 to 15 years in a federal penitentiary for massive tax evasion and corporate fraud. But your problems do not stop there, Elias. Let us talk about the $15 million loan you gave my idiot brother." I grabbed the blue foreclosure notice off the table and shoved it against his chest. "You accepted this property as collateral based on a signature from Winston Sterling," I said, gesturing toward my grandfather, who sat silently watching the execution unfold. "But Winston never signed that document. My brother Preston forged the signature. And because Preston is an arrogant, lazy fool, he botched the cursive loops and used a fake notary seal. That means this entire contract is legally void. You have absolutely zero claim to this estate. You have zero claim to the logistics company. You handed Charles and Preston $15 million in clean cash, and in return, they handed you a worthless piece of paper. You got played." The color rapidly drained from Elias Vance's face. He looked down at the blue document, then back up at me. His chest heaved as his mind raced to catch up with the trap that had just snapped shut around his ankles. He had walked into this house expecting to bully an invalid old man and a helpless secretary. Instead, he had walked directly into a digital slaughterhouse. "I will take this to court," Elias threatened, but his voice lacked the deep booming conviction it carried just moments ago. "I have a team of corporate lawyers who will tie this estate up in litigation for the next decade. I will bleed you dry in legal fees until you beg me to take the house." "If you take this to court," I replied smoothly, crossing my arms over my chest, "the first thing a judge will order is a full discovery phase. They will subpoena Vanguard Equity's entire financial ledger. They will pull your bank records. They will see the Cyprus accounts, the Macau wire transfers, and the Cayman Islands blind trust. If you try to enforce this fraudulent loan, you will personally hand the Securities and Exchange Commission a golden ticket to audit your entire life." Elias swallowed hard. The two security contractors exchanged nervous glances, suddenly realizing that their boss was rapidly losing control of the situation. "So here is what is going to happen," I said, delivering the final devastating blow. "I have drafted an email containing your complete offshore banking history, the unrecorded wire transfer codes, and the exact routing numbers for your illegal Cyprus shell companies. The recipient line is currently populated with the direct email addresses of 3 senior investigators at the SEC whom I happen to know personally." I held up my phone, my thumb hovering deliberately over the send button. "You are going to open that expensive Italian leather briefcase you are holding," I commanded. "You are going to take out every single original physical debt contract Preston and Charles signed. You are going to hand them to me right now. If you hesitate, if you argue, if you try to negotiate, I will press this button and I will end your life as a free man." Elias stared at me, his dark eyes wide with a mixture of pure hatred and genuine terror. He finally realized the absolute fatal error he had made. He had severely underestimated the scapegoat daughter. He had looked at me and seen a victim. He had failed to see the executioner waiting just beneath the surface. "I am giving you 5 seconds, Elias," I said, my voice cold and hard as iron. 5, 4, 3. "Wait," Elias gasped, holding up a shaking hand. He swallowed heavily, his pride completely shattering under the weight of his own criminal liability. He placed his expensive leather briefcase flat on the mahogany dining table. His fingers trembled slightly as he popped the brass latches and flipped the lid open. He reached inside and pulled out a thick stack of heavy bond paper. They were the original wet ink contracts, the fraudulent documents that tied this house and my grandfather's legacy to Vanguard Equity. He slid the stack of papers across the polished wood until they rested in front of me. "Take them," Elias muttered, his voice barely a rasp. "Just delete the file." I picked up the stack of papers, verifying the signatures and the notary stamps. I had the originals. The leverage was completely mine. "Get out of my house," I said, my voice echoing with quiet, absolute victory. "And if you ever come within 50 miles of my grandfather again, I will destroy you." Elias Vance did not say another word. He snapped his empty briefcase shut, turned on his heel, and marched toward the grand foyer. His 2 massive security guards followed closely behind him, their aggressive posturing completely deflated. The heavy oak front door opened and slammed shut, shutting out the howling winter wind and leaving the estate in profound silence. I stood there for a moment, letting the adrenaline slowly recede from my veins. I had done it. I had faced down a ruthless predator and completely dismantled him using nothing but my own intellect and the very skills my family had always mocked. I turned back toward the table, tossing the original fraudulent contracts onto the dark mahogany wood. "Well, Grandpa," I said, a triumphant smile breaking across my face, "I think we just solved the private equity problem. Now all we have to do is wait for Charles to realize his offshore accounts are empty." I expected Winston to smile back. I expected him to revel in the absolute flawless execution of our counterattack. But the silence in the dining room felt suddenly wrong. Heavy, suffocating. I stepped closer to the table, my smile fading instantly. Winston was not looking at the contracts. He was slumped sideways in his wheelchair, his chin resting heavily against his chest. His face had gone a terrifying shade of ashen gray. His right hand was gripped tightly in the fabric of his heavy wool blanket, right over his heart. His knuckles were bone white from the sheer strain. "Grandpa!" I called out, my voice spiking with sudden, sharp panic. He did not answer. His breathing was rapid and terribly shallow, a wet, ragged, rasping sound that filled the quiet room. The stress of the betrayal, the sheer adrenaline of the confrontation, and the overwhelming weight of his own son's monstrous plan had finally breached his defenses. The iron will that had sustained him through the assault was collapsing, taking his failing physical health down with it. Winston let out a low, agonizing groan and his eyes rolled back. His grip on the blanket went entirely slack and he collapsed hard into the padded arm of his wheelchair. I lunged across the table, the heavy mahogany digging into my ribs, and grabbed Winston by the shoulders. I hauled him back into an upright position, frantically ripping open the heavy wool blanket and plunging my hands into the pockets of his cardigan. My fingers closed around the small glass vial of his prescription nitroglycerin spray. I yanked the cap off, pried his jaw open, and administered 2 sharp bursts under his tongue. "Breathe," I commanded, my voice shaking with a terrifying cocktail of adrenaline and dread. "Look at me, Grandpa. Look right at me. Do not close your eyes." For 10 agonizing seconds, the only sound in the cavernous dining room was the howling winter wind battering the leaded glass windows. Then Winston took a sharp, ragged gasp of air. His chest heaved, and a faint trace of color began to creep back into his ashen cheeks. His fingers twitched, releasing their death grip on the blanket. He blinked heavily, his eyes slowly focusing on my face. "I need to call an ambulance," I said, reaching for my phone. "We are going to the hospital." "No!" Winston rasped, his hand shooting out to grip my wrist with surprising strength. "No hospitals. If I leave this estate, Charles will intercept the medical transit. He has doctors on his payroll. He will use the hospitalization to justify the psychiatric committal. He will legally lock me away before morning." "You just had a cardiac event," I argued, pulling my wrist away. "You need a doctor." "I need a lawyer," Winston countered, his voice growing steadier with every breath. "I need a counter-will and an immediate transfer of absolute executive power. Call Gregory. Tell him to get here right now. We are going to sever Charles from the family trust tonight." I hesitated, looking at his pale face, but the absolute blazing determination in his eyes told me arguing was useless. Winston Sterling was not a man who surrendered to his own failing body. I pulled up my contacts and dialed Gregory Vance. Gregory had been the Sterling family attorney for over 3 decades. He had drafted the original corporate charters, executed my parents' divorce, and managed the family trust since before I was born. When I called him and briefly explained that Winston had suffered a medical episode and required an immediate legal consultation regarding Charles, Gregory promised to be there in 20 minutes. He arrived in 15. I unlocked the heavy oak front door, and Gregory stepped out of the swirling snow. He wore a pristine cashmere overcoat and carried a monogrammed leather briefcase smelling strongly of expensive scotch and designer cologne. He brushed past me with a curt nod, completely ignoring the fact that I was standing there freezing in the draft. "Where is he?" Gregory asked, stripping off his leather gloves. "In the dining room," I replied, securing the deadbolt. "He is stable, but he is weak. He wants to execute a total revocation of Charles's proxy." Gregory stopped halfway down the hall, turning to look at me with an expression of deep, theatrical concern. He sighed heavily, running a hand through his perfectly styled silver hair. "Fiona, you must realize the incredible stress you are putting him under. Charles warned me you were filling his head with these paranoid conspiracy theories." I felt a cold prickle of warning run down my spine. I had not told Gregory anything about Charles's conspiracy over the phone. I had only mentioned a medical episode and a proxy revocation. I led Gregory into the dining room. He approached the table, taking in the sight of Winston slumped in the wheelchair, the scattered decryption equipment, and the dual monitors displaying the offshore financial routing data. Gregory did not ask about Winston's health. His eyes immediately locked onto the 3 heavy encrypted flash drives resting on the table next to my laptop. "Winston," Gregory said, pulling out a chair and sitting down with a heavy, dramatic sigh. This is madness. You look terrible, old friend. We need to get you proper medical attention, not force you to sign legal documents in the middle of the night. I am not going anywhere until my signature is on a new charter. Winston said, his voice a low, gravelly threat. Charles has embezzled millions. He has forged my signature on a $15 million private equity loan with Vanguard. I want him legally radioactive. I want Fiona granted total absolute power of attorney over my health care and my estate. Gregory offered a sympathetic, condescending smile that did not reach his cold eyes. Winston, you are confused. Charles is in Switzerland managing the European expansion. There is no forged loan. There is no embezzlement. You are having an episode. He reached across the table, his hand moving smoothly toward the encrypted flash drives. Let me secure these files for the firm's vault. We can review them properly when you are resting and thinking clearly. I slammed my hand down flat over the drives, blocking his grasp. The chain of custody stays with me until we file the federal indictment, I said, staring him down. Gregory pulled his hand back, his sympathetic smile instantly hardening into a mask of pure arrogant annoyance. He looked at me as if I were a stain on the antique rug. Fiona, please, Gregory said, his tone dripping with patronizing disdain. You have done a nice job organizing your grandfather's little paranoid delusions, but let us leave the complex corporate finances to the men of the family. You are a bookkeeper. You do not understand the legal exposure here. You are playing with federal territory, and you are completely out of your depth. My mind snapped the puzzle pieces together with violent clarity. Federal territory. I had not said a single word about federal fraud. I had not mentioned the SEC. I remembered sitting in Gregory's pristine downtown office 3 years ago, handing him a meticulously drafted business plan for my own independent auditing firm. I had asked him to process a simple legal incorporation. He had leaned across his massive desk, smiled that exact same condescending smile, and told me that women in the Sterling family were better suited for planning charity galas, not running financial institutions. He had deliberately stalled my incorporation, backing Charles's mandate to keep me financially dependent and entirely under their control. I looked at the forged medical certificate still displayed on my secondary monitor. I looked at the notary seal stamped at the bottom of the fraudulent Vanguard loan. It was Gregory's seal. Charles did not act alone. I realized my blood running like ice water through my veins. Charles was lazy. He did not know how to draft a bulletproof, durable power of attorney. He did not know how to structure an involuntary psychiatric committal that would bypass state scrutiny. He needed a legal architect. He needed the family lawyer. Winston, listen to me, Gregory said, turning his back to me completely and leaning closer to my grandfather. Charles called me from Zurich. He warned me you were having these violent hallucinations. He told me you were becoming a danger to yourself. Fiona is just confusing you. She is taking advantage of your declining mental state. Let me take the drives. Let me call Dr. Thorne. He can give you something to help you sleep. Winston wavered, his breathing growing shallow again, as the psychological warfare combined with his sheer physical exhaustion began to wear him down. He looked at me, his eyes silently asking if he was actually losing his mind. I did not argue. I did not scream or accuse Gregory of treason. I simply took a slow, deliberate step backward, retreating into the shadows of the dining room archway. I let my shoulders slump, projecting total, absolute defeat. Gregory glanced at me over his shoulder, an ugly, triumphant smirk crossing his face as he believed he had successfully broken the scapegoat daughter. I walked over to the antique sideboard where my secondary routing laptop sat open and running. I turned my back to the room. Gregory pulled his phone from his breast pocket. I heard the faint, rapid tapping of his thumbs against the glass screen. He was initiating a secure communication line. I did not need physical access to his phone. The entire estate was wired with a localized mesh Wi-Fi network that I had personally installed and encrypted. Gregory's phone was automatically connected to the local network the moment he walked through the front door. My fingers flew across my keyboard in total silence. I executed a localized packet sniffing protocol, breaching the network traffic and mirroring his unencrypted mobile data directly onto my screen. The digital intercept flashed green, capturing the outgoing SMS payload before it even hit the cellular tower. I isolated the text message, reading the words glowing starkly against the black terminal window. The recipient was a Swiss country code. It was Charles. The message read perfectly clear on my screen. The girl knows too much. Accelerating the timeline. I'm taking the drives. I read the words of the medical certificate again, forcing myself to absorb the clinical detached language. Dr. Eris Thorne described Winston as exhibiting severe rapid onset cognitive decline. The report falsely claimed my grandfather was prone to sudden violent outbursts and entirely incapable of managing his own physical or financial well-being. The document authorized an immediate involuntary committal to the Oak Ridge Psychiatric Institute. I knew Oak Ridge. It was a bleak, severely underfunded state-run facility, notorious for being a heavily medicated dumping ground for unwanted elderly wards. It was a sterile, heavily secured prison, masquerading as a hospital where people went to disappear and never come back. Charles was not just a thief, he was a monster. He was planning to lock his own father in a living nightmare just to cover his financial tracks. I clicked on a reply from my mother. Beverly had actually chimed in on the email chain to complain about the exorbitant consulting fee of Dr. Thorne. She haggled over the cost of the medical bribe, ultimately agreeing that it was a necessary expense to avoid paying off the $15 million private equity loan. She even complained about the extra hourly rate required for the 2 private medical orderlies who would be tasked with physically restraining Winston during the extraction. I read the emails out loud to Winston, my voice shaking with a rage so visceral it made my teeth ache. Charles had the timeline mapped out with terrifying precision. The emails outlined a horrific premeditated plan. He and Beverly were scheduled to fly back from Zurich on the morning of New Year's Eve. They planned to walk through the front door of this estate at exactly 4 o'clock in the afternoon, flanked by the private medical contractors. They were going to ambush Winston, dragging him out of the very home he built under the guise of an emergency psychiatric hold. By legally declaring him incompetent, Charles would automatically trigger the medical proxy and durable power of attorney clauses he had already slipped into the forged loan documents. With Winston forcibly removed from the equation, Charles would gain absolute total control over every single asset. He could approve the liquidation of the company default on the aggressive private equity loan and walk away with the embezzled offshore millions. Winston would rot in a state facility stripped of his phone, his dignity, and his civil rights, completely unable to contact a lawyer or fight back. I expected Winston to collapse. I expected the sheer weight of his own son's betrayal to break whatever spirit he had left. For decades, Winston had been the patriarch, the untouchable titan of the logistics industry. To see his own flesh and blood orchestrate such an evil clinical destruction of his life should have been a fatal blow to his heart. I turned my chair around, half preparing to catch him, assuming he would be overwhelmed by the shock. But the man reading the email over my shoulder was not a victim. The slight practiced tremor in his hands was completely gone. His posture was rigid, his jaw locked tight. Instead of despair, his eyes hardened with an absolute terrifying resolve. He looked down at me. For my entire life, I had been the designated family outcast, the disappointment who refused to play the game, the stubborn girl who chose to study accounting instead of marrying into country club money. Charles and Beverly had spent years making sure I knew my place at the bottom of the family hierarchy. But right now, in the freezing gloom of the dining room, the family outcast was the only person standing between Winston and total annihilation. "They want to play God with my life and my company," Winston growled. His voice did not shake. It resonated with the dark, unyielding authority of a man who had built a national empire from the dirt up. "Burn them to the ground, Fiona. Every last one of them." I turned back to the glowing monitors, a cold smile touching my lips. Gladly. I cracked my knuckles and launched a deep web extraction protocol. If my father wanted to play a game of legal leverage, we were going to rewrite the entire rulebook. I started downloading every single email, transferring the encrypted offshore routing numbers, and copying the fraudulent medical certificate. This was no longer just a corporate audit to save a logistics company. It was a criminal investigation into elder abuse, fraud, and extortion. I thought about all of the times Charles had publicly belittled my career. He had told his wealthy friends that I was just a glorified human calculator, a girl who stamped receipts for a living, while Preston was out closing massive real estate deals. His supreme arrogance had perfectly blinded him to the reality of modern forensic accounting. I was not just balancing his checkbook, I was tracing his digital footprints, mapping his proxy servers, and building an airtight federal indictment right under his nose. By assuming I was stupid, he had handed me the exact weapon I needed to dismantle his entire life. "We need to move the clean capital immediately," I told Winston, my fingers flying across the keyboard. The $15 million balloon payment triggers on December 31st. If we drain the primary holding accounts and transfer your legitimate personal assets into an airtight blind trust, Charles will be left holding an empty bag. When the private equity firm comes to collect their collateral, they will find absolute zero liquidity. Can you authorize a mass transfer without triggering a notification to Charles in Zurich? Winston asked, watching the complex lines of code cascade down my monitor. I already locked his executive assistant out of the mainframe, I explained, initiating a secondary bypass. Now I am establishing a ghost server. It creates a mirrored synthetic loop of the company's financial state. When Charles logs in from his luxury ski lodge, he will see exactly what he wants to see. He will see a fat, healthy account ready to be liquidated. He will not realize the money is already gone until the federal agents are putting him in handcuffs. The digital transfer required immense processing power. The dual monitors cast a harsh, stark blue glow across the opulent dining room, illuminating the heavy silver centerpieces and the crystal chandeliers my mother prized so highly. We were sitting in the heart of a stolen empire, slowly draining its lifeblood back into the hands of its rightful owner. I hit the final execution command, initiating the mass transfer of Winston's personal wealth and the company's remaining clean operating capital into a newly formed, heavily encrypted trust. The progress bar on my screen inched forward agonizingly slow, 10%, 20%. While the transfer processed, I pulled up the rest of the emails from Beverly. My mother had actually sent a follow-up message to the corrupt doctor, complaining that the psychiatric facility did not allow patients to bring their own personal clothing. She was severely annoyed because she had just bought Winston a cheap set of pajamas for Christmas to maintain appearances, and she didn't want the money to go to waste. The absolute callousness was suffocating. She was actively planning to commit her father-in-law to a state asylum, and her biggest concern was a $30 pair of polyester pajamas. 50%. The wind outside began to howl, rattling the tall leaded window panes of the formal dining room. The massive old house creaked, settling against the bitter winter cold. We were entirely alone. The household staff had been given the entire week off by Charles to ensure total privacy for his New Year's Eve ambush. We were supposed to be sitting ducks, completely isolated and waiting for the slaughter. "He always was a coward," Winston said softly, his eyes fixed intensely on the progress bar. Charles never could look a man in the eye when he bested him. He always preferred the knife in the back. I spent my whole life trying to teach him how to build, how to create value through hard work. I should have been teaching you. I felt a tight, painful knot in my chest finally unravel at his words. For 30 years, I had desperately craved validation from this family. I had worked myself to the bone, chasing an impossible standard set by a mother who despised my independence and a father who ignored my existence. And now the only person whose respect actually mattered was sitting beside me, treating me like a true equal. "We are going to take it all back, Grandpa," I promised him, my voice fierce and steady. "By the time Charles lands in Chicago, he won't have a single penny to his name." 90%. The transfer was almost complete. The digital vault was sealing, preparing to shut Charles and Preston out of the logistics empire forever. I reached for my cold cup of coffee, feeling a triumphant smile spread across my face as the progress bar hit 99%. A heavy, aggressive pounding echoed from the front door, shattering the quiet of the estate. Gregory's manicured fingers brushed the cold metal of the encrypted flash drives resting on the mahogany table. "I will be taking these to the firm's vault." he announced, his voice layered with false practiced authority. "We can review them properly when Winston is resting and thinking clearly." "Drop them," I said. My voice did not rise above a conversational volume, but the absolute frozen certainty in it made Gregory freeze. I turned around from the antique sideboard, my secondary laptop still glowing behind me. I had not taken my eyes off the digital intercept pulsing on the screen. "Don't be ridiculous, Fiona," Gregory scoffed, recovering his arrogant posture and puffing out his chest. "Leave the complex corporate finances to the men of the family. You are clearly overwrought, and you are playing a very dangerous game with federal territory." "I intercepted your outgoing text message to Charles," I stated, stepping into the center of the room. "The one where you just told him the girl knows too much and you are accelerating the timeline by taking the drives." Gregory's face dropped. The smug, patronizing mask shattered in an instant, revealing the panicked, cornered animal underneath. He pulled his hand away from the drives, as if they had suddenly caught fire. I didn't stop. I pressed the advantage, bringing up the financial documents on my main monitor and rotating the screen so he was forced to look at his own destruction. While I was mapping Charles's offshore accounts, I noticed a very interesting recurring anomaly. I continued pacing slowly toward him. For the past 5 years, a shell company in the Cayman Islands has been funneling regular unrecorded capital injections into your personal domestic accounts. Kickbacks. Charles has been paying you millions in dirty money to slowly and deliberately rewrite Winston's estate plans, isolating him and transferring executive control directly into Charles's hands. "You have no proof of that," Gregory stammered, taking a step back. His eyes darted nervously toward the heavy oak door. "I have the digital routing numbers, the IP addresses of your login attempts, and the forged notary seal you placed on a $15 million fraudulent loan." I fired back, tapping the master ledger. "I am a senior forensic auditor, Gregory. I dismantle financial criminals for a living. You have exactly 30 seconds to walk out that front door. If you are still on this property when the clock runs out, I am sending this entire compiled dossier to the ethics board for immediate disbarment and copying the federal authorities. You will die in a federal prison." Gregory looked at my face, searching desperately for a bluff. He found nothing but a cold, lethal promise. He dropped his expensive leather briefcase on the floor, turned, and fled. His hurried, frantic footsteps echoed down the grand foyer, followed by the heavy, echoing slam of the front door. Silence descended on the dining room, save for the howling wind battering the leaded glass windows. Winston sat in his wheelchair, his chest heaving slightly as he processed the sheer magnitude of the treason that had been operating right inside his home. He looked at the abandoned briefcase, and then at me. "I have no legal representation," he rasped, the reality of his profound isolation finally setting in. "Charles has completely severed me from anyone I can trust. The corporate charter requires a bonded attorney to authorize any immediate transfer of executive power." I smiled, a slow, predatory expression that felt entirely natural on my face. I stepped fully into the light of the monitors, embracing the power I had spent my life building in the dark. "You don't need Gregory, Grandpa," I said softly. "You have me." I pulled out my phone and dialed a New York number. It was 3 in the morning on the East Coast, but the man I was calling owed his entire trajectory to my forensic audits. "Marcus," I said when the line clicked open, "I need you in Chicago. Get on a red-eye flight right now. Bring a board-certified independent psychiatrist. We are executing a hostile corporate takeover by dawn." By 7 o'clock the next morning, the formal dining room had been transformed into an impenetrable legal war room. The massive mahogany table was buried under stacks of fresh watermarked legal documents, corporate charters, and binding affidavits. The digital hum of portable printers and secure laptops replaced the tension of the previous night. Marcus Vance, my firm's top corporate litigator and an absolute shark in the courtroom, sat across from Winston. He looked immaculate despite the overnight travel, radiating sharp, aggressive competence. Next to him was Dr. Evelyn Hayes, a fiercely intelligent independent psychiatrist Marcus had flown in exclusively for this exact moment. She had set up a digital recording device on a tripod, capturing the entire evaluation to ensure it was absolutely bulletproof against any future litigation. Mr. Sterling, Dr. Hayes asked, her voice professional and calm. Can you clearly state the current date, your location, and the specific reason you requested this evaluation? It is Monday, December 30th. Winston replied, his voice carrying the deep, unyielding resonance of a king reclaiming his throne. I am sitting in the dining room of my family estate in Chicago. I requested this evaluation to legally and permanently prove I am entirely of sound mind, so I can strip my traitorous son of every ounce of power he possesses. Dr. Hayes ran him through a grueling, highly specialized cognitive assessment. She tested his short-term memory, his analytical reasoning, and his comprehension of complex, multi-tiered corporate structures. Winston answered every single question with razor-sharp lucidity. He quoted profit margins, dismantled hypothetical logistical failures, and demonstrated a total grasp of his reality. By the time she clicked off the recording device, there was no doubt left in the room. He is perfectly lucid and entirely competent to execute legal documents, Dr. Hayes declared, signing her name to a thick stack of medical affidavits with a firm flourish. Any previous diagnosis claiming otherwise is an absolute fabrication. Marcus immediately slid a heavy leather-bound folder across the table. This is a total revocation of all previous wills, medical proxies, and powers of attorney, Marcus explained, handing Winston a heavy gold fountain pen. Signing this instantly voids any authority Charles or Gregory Vance claim to possess. They are legally locked out. Winston took the pen and signed his name with aggressive, sweeping strokes, tearing the paper slightly with the force of his conviction. And this, Marcus continued, presenting the final, most critical document from the folder, is the new corporate charter and estate directive. It transfers 51% absolute controlling interest of the entire Sterling logistics empire and your personal estate directly over to Fiona, effective immediately. Charles cannot liquidate, sell, or leverage a single asset without her explicit written authorization. You are making her the undisputed head of the family. Winston did not hesitate. He signed the charter officially, sealing the power transfer. The ink dried on the thick paper, cementing my position, not as a marginalized outcast or a scapegoat daughter, but as the absolute majority shareholder of a multi-million-dollar corporate empire. Marcus and Dr. Hayes quietly excused themselves to the kitchen to begin filing the digital injunctions with the state courts, leaving Winston and me alone in the war room. My grandfather looked down at the freshly signed documents. His hands trembled slightly, not from physical weakness, but from an overwhelming wave of emotion. He looked up at me, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "I am so sorry, Fiona," Winston whispered, his voice cracking with the weight of a decade of regret. "I should have seen the truth years ago. I should have protected you. You were manipulated, Grandpa," I replied softly, pulling up a chair and sitting closely beside him. "Charles isolated you. He fed you lies." "It wasn't just Charles," Winston said, a profound sorrow etched deeply into his weathered face. "It was Beverly. When you left for New York to start your career, I waited for you to write. I waited for you to call. I thought we had an understanding. But Beverly told me you wanted nothing to do with us. She intercepted every single piece of mail coming into this estate. She told me you hated me, that you only cared about your career, and that you demanded I never contact you again." The revelation hit me like a physical blow, stealing the breath from my lungs. The years of silence, the pain of feeling entirely abandoned by the only family member I respected, it had all been a meticulously crafted illusion. "I wrote to you every month for the first 3 years," I said, my voice barely a whisper, as the final agonizing pieces of the puzzle fell into place. "Beverly sent them all back to my apartment. She stamped them 'Return to Sender' and attached notes claiming you personally ordered her to reject my mail. She told me I was dead to you." Winston reached out and gripped my hand tightly, his knuckles white. We had both been victims of the exact same psychological warfare, kept apart by a family that viewed my independence and his authority as direct threats to their own greed. They had weaponized our pride against us, ensuring we would never compare notes. Before I could offer another word of comfort, before I could fully process the magnitude of the theft of our relationship, the sharp, shrill chime of a text message echoed through the quiet room. I picked up my phone from the table. The screen lit up displaying a message from Beverly. The timing was chilling. I opened the text, my eyes scanning the words as the familiar coldness of battle settled back over my heart. The time for mourning lost years was over. The execution was at hand. I read the message aloud, my voice entirely devoid of emotion. Change of plans. We are flying back a day early. Have Grandpa's bags packed for the clinic. Don't mess this up. I stared at the glowing screen of my phone, letting the words burn into my mind. The timeline had just collapsed. Charles and Beverly were not waiting for New Year's Eve. Gregory must have managed to warn them before I completely severed his access, or they simply smelled the smoke and decided to accelerate the kill. We had less than 12 hours before they walked through the front doors with a forged medical warrant and a team of private orderlies. Marcus did not blink. He pulled his phone from his pocket and looked at his heavy silver watch. The courts open in exactly 2 hours. He said, his voice sharp and utterly devoid of panic. We need to move from defensive positioning to a total scorched earth offensive. We are going to lock them out of the global financial system before their flight even touches down at O'Hare. I turned back to my laptop, cracking my knuckles. The exhaustion that had been threatening to pull me under completely vanished, replaced by a cold, lethal surge of adrenaline. Let us strip them to the bone, I said. Marcus transformed the dining room into a battlefield command center. He immediately conferenced in 3 junior partners from his New York firm, barking orders and delegating the massive workload with ruthless efficiency. We needed emergency ex parte injunctions filed in federal court the moment the clerks arrived at their desks. To get a federal judge to sign off on an immediate unilateral asset freeze without the defendants present, we needed a mountain of indisputable forensic proof. I had the mountain. I began exporting the data packets I had spent the last 72 hours compiling. I handed Marcus the digitized routing logs showing Charles transferring millions from the corporate operating accounts into his personal shell companies in Zurich. I provided the offshore kickback trails linking Charles directly to Gregory Vance, proving a systemic multi-year conspiracy to defraud the estate. And finally, I presented the crown jewel. The $15 million Vanguard equity contract bearing the forged signature of Winston Sterling and the fraudulent notary seal. Marcus fed the data directly to his team. Within 3 hours, they had drafted a staggering legal barricade. They filed emergency motions in the Northern District of Illinois, requesting an immediate freeze on every single asset connected to the conspirators. At 9:45 in the morning, Marcus received a notification on his secure tablet. A federal judge had reviewed the overwhelming forensic evidence of corporate embezzlement and wire fraud. The injunctions were granted. It was done. In the span of a single morning, we had successfully executed a total financial blackout. Every corporate account Charles controlled was frozen. Every personal bank account tied to Beverly was locked. Preston's trust funds, his luxury vehicle leases, his credit cards, and his investment portfolios were completely suspended. They were currently flying 30,000 feet over the Atlantic Ocean, entirely unaware that they were returning to absolute financial ruin. They could not buy a cup of coffee, let alone hire a team of high-priced defense attorneys to protect them from what was coming next. But locking them out of their money was only the first phase of the counterattack. Charles had attempted to steal an empire and falsely imprison his own father in a psychiatric ward. A simple asset freeze was not justice. It was just a temporary roadblock. I wanted absolute permanent destruction. I opened a highly secure encrypted communication portal on my terminal. As a senior forensic auditor, I regularly collaborated with federal agencies to dismantle corporate syndicates. I had direct lines to people who did not play games with white-collar criminals. I compiled the master ledger, the offshore routing numbers, the forged medical certificate from Dr. Thorne, and the fabricated Vanguard loan documents into a single heavily encrypted dossier. I organized the data meticulously, ensuring that any prosecutor looking at the file would instantly see a bulletproof open and shut case. I attached a brief executive summary outlining the exact statutes of federal wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit elder abuse. I addressed the entire digital package to the lead supervising agent of the FBI White Collar Crime Division in Chicago. I hovered my finger over the mousepad looking at the blinking cursor. Once I sent this file, there was no turning back. Charles and Preston would not just lose their jobs. They would face decades in a federal penitentiary. Beverly would be stripped of her status, her country club memberships, and the stolen wealth she used to bludgeon everyone around her. I thought about the sleazy landlord in Chicago. I thought about Charles hanging up the phone while I begged for help. I thought about Beverly returning my letters so I would feel utterly alone. I pressed the button. The upload bar flashed green, and the dossier vanished into the federal servers. The trap was perfectly set. Every exit was sealed. Every loophole was closed. There was absolutely no escape. Marcus and Dr. Hayes departed shortly after the federal filings were confirmed, slipping out the back entrance to avoid drawing any attention. They had played their parts flawlessly, and now they needed to be clear of the blast radius. The physical confrontation was going to be a family matter. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the estate was wrapped in a profound, heavy silence. The raging winter storm from the previous night had finally broken, leaving the sprawling grounds buried under 2 feet of pristine, untouched snow. The sky outside the leaded glass windows was a pale, bruised gray. I walked into the grand living room where Winston was sitting in his wheelchair, positioned deliberately near the roaring stone fireplace. The flames cast dancing golden shadows across his face, highlighting the sharp, unyielding lines of his jaw. He looked incredibly tired, but the sheer, terrifying authority that defined him had fully returned. He was no longer a victim waiting to be discarded. He was a king waiting to execute traitors. I poured 2 cups of hot Earl Grey tea, carrying them over and handing him one. He took the fine china cup, his hands perfectly steady. "Is everything in place?" he asked, his voice a low, quiet rumble over the crackling fire. "The accounts are frozen," I replied, sitting in the high-backed leather armchair opposite him. "The FBI has the master ledgers. Your new corporate charter is legally binding and filed with the state. When Charles walks through those doors, he owns absolutely nothing." Winston took a slow sip of his tea, his eyes reflecting the flames. "He always thought he was the smartest man in the room," Winston murmured. "He believed arrogance was a substitute for intelligence. He is going to learn a very hard lesson today about the cost of underestimating the people you are supposed to protect." We sat in comfortable silence, letting the warmth of the fire push back against the bitter cold radiating from the windows. For the first time in my entire life, I felt perfectly safe inside this house. I was no longer the unwanted outcast seeking crumbs of validation. I was the architect of their destruction, and I was holding all the keys. The heavy antique grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 4 times. The deep resonant notes echoed through the empty mansion, signaling the arrival of the deadline. A moment later, the quiet of the afternoon was shattered. The unmistakable heavy crunch of tires rolling over the snow-packed gravel driveway drifted through the windows. I stood up slowly, setting my teacup down on the mahogany side table. I smoothed the wrinkles from my simple sweater and took a deep, steadying breath. "They are here," Winston said, his voice turning to steel. I turned and walked toward the grand foyer, ready to welcome my family home. The heavy oak double doors of the grand foyer did not just open, they burst inward, violently driven by the bitter Chicago wind and the sheer arrogant force of the people entering. A swirl of white snow and freezing air blasted across the pristine marble floor, but it was instantly drowned out by the deafening, obnoxious sound of laughter. Charles Beverly and Preston Sterling crossed the threshold, moving with the loud, aggressive entitlement of conquering royalty returning to claim their spoils. They were radiating the obnoxious glow of a luxury European vacation. Their skin was deeply tanned from a week in the Swiss Alps, a stark contrast to the bleak Midwestern winter they had just stepped into. They were laden with glossy, oversized shopping bags, bearing the stark logos of Prada, Patek Philippe, and Moncler. They tracked wet slush and gray street salt directly across the antique Persian runner, completely oblivious to the mess they were creating. I stood silently under the grand archway of the living room, my hands resting at my sides, watching them. They did not even look at me. To them, I was part of the architecture, an invisible piece of furniture expected to absorb their noise and clean up their debris. Beverly stepped forward, shivering dramatically as she unbuttoned her heavy white, fur-lined ski coat. She did not look for a hanger. She did not carry it to the coat closet. She simply shrugged her shoulders and let the impossibly expensive garment slide down her back, allowing it to drop onto a wet puddle of slush on the marble floor. "Pick that up!" Fiona Beverly commanded, her voice sharp and brittle, clipping through the vast foyer. "And fetch me a sparkling water with a slice of lemon." The flight from Zurich was an absolute nightmare. The private terminal at O'Hare had the heat turned down to 65 degrees. "I am practically frozen to the bone." She stepped out of her boots, kicking them carelessly against the baseboards. She finally spared a quick, dismissive glance in my direction, her eyes sweeping over my plain gray sweater and dark slacks. "Where is the medical transport van?" Beverly demanded, snapping her manicured fingers to emphasize her impatience. "I explicitly told Dr. Thorne to have his private contractors waiting in the driveway by 3:30. I will not have this neighborhood subjected to the spectacle of a shrieking old man being dragged out the front door. We need him loaded and gone before the neighbors start arriving for their evening galas." Charles walked in behind her, completely ignoring his wife's complaints. He was aggressively tapping the screen of his phone, a deep scowl carving heavy lines into his tanned forehead. The sheer staggering incompetence of global banking. Charles muttered loudly, not speaking to anyone in particular, but demanding the room's attention anyway. American Express had the absolute audacity to decline my black card at the private aviation lounge. A massive security hold across the entire portfolio. "I will have the regional director of fraud prevention fired first thing Monday morning." Unbelievable. He shoved the phone into his tailored cashmere overcoat and finally looked up, scanning the empty hallway. "Is the old man heavily sedated?" Charles asked, his voice devoid of a single ounce of empathy for the father he was about to institutionalize. "I told Thorne to prescribe a maximum dosage of chemical restraints. If Winston is lucid enough to talk to the orderlies, it will create unnecessary legal friction. I want him entirely incapacitated when they strap him to the gurney." I remained perfectly still. I did not pick up the coat. I did not answer their horrific questions. I simply watched them dig their own graves with every word they spoke. Preston swaggered in, last dropping 3 heavy shopping bags onto the floor. He ignored the tension in the room, walking past me with a smug, satisfied grin plastered across his face. He headed straight for the antique mahogany bar cart stationed at the edge of the living room. He unstoppered a crystal decanter of Winston's most expensive 50-year-old Macallan Scotch and poured himself a generous drink, not bothering to offer one to his parents. Still wearing the exact same tragic sweaters, Fiona Preston sneered, leaning against the bar cart and taking a slow sip of the amber liquid. He looked me up and down with an expression of pure, unadulterated pity. "You really spent your entire New Year's Eve sitting in this drafty mausoleum, babysitting a dying old man. It is actually pathetic." We were in Zurich closing massive corporate acquisitions, dining with Swiss banking executives, and skiing private glaciers. "You are spending the prime years of your life acting as an unpaid hospice nurse." Preston chuckled, setting his glass down. He reached into the pocket of his tailored trousers and pulled out a gold money clip. He peeled off a crisp $100 bill, crumpled it tightly in his fist, and flicked it casually through the air. The small green ball bounced off my shoulder and landed on the marble floor, coming to rest directly at the toe of my shoe. "For babysitting the old man," Preston said, turning his back to me and picking up his scotch, "go buy yourself a decent dress. Or a personality. Whichever is cheaper." I looked down at the crumpled $100 bill resting against the cold stone. I stared at the face of Benjamin Franklin, and in that singular green piece of paper, I saw the entire miserable history of my existence within this family. I saw the day I turned 18, holding my college acceptance letter to an advanced accounting program, begging Charles to co-sign a modest student loan so I could afford my tuition. He had laughed, tossed a $50 bill on the kitchen counter, and told me to get a job waiting tables because women in the Sterling family did not need advanced degrees. I saw the day I graduated at the absolute top of my university class, Beverly had purchased Preston a $30,000 Rolex for finishing his basic business degree with a completely mediocre C average. She had handed me a generic $20 coffee shop gift card and told me not to spend it all in one place. I saw every Christmas, every Thanksgiving, every forced family dinner where they actively worked to make me feel small, unworthy, and entirely invisible. They had conditioned me to believe that I was nothing more than a budgetary afterthought, a cheap, disposable nuisance that could be swatted away with pocket change. They had built their towering egos on the foundation of my constant humiliation. They thought they were tossing a bone to a starving dog. They had absolutely no idea they were flicking pennies at a billionaire. I did not bend down to pick up the bill. I did not bend down to pick up the heavy fur coat. I simply raised my chin. The terrified, subservient girl they had left behind in Chicago was gone, completely burned away in the crucible of the last 72 hours. I turned my back on Preston's smug face and walked slowly, deliberately back to the high-backed leather armchair near the roaring fireplace. Winston watched me from his wheelchair, his eyes burning with silent pride. I picked up my delicate china teacup, wrapping my fingers around the warm porcelain. I took a slow, measured sip of Earl Grey, letting the silence in the room stretch until it became heavy and profoundly uncomfortable. Charles, Beverly, and Preston stopped moving, their arrogant laughter finally dying out as they realized I was not scrambling to follow their orders. I lowered the teacup, placing it softly onto the saucer. I looked at the three of them with an absolute terrifying calm that froze the air in their lungs. "The transport van isn't coming," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the grand foyer. "But you three need to start packing your bags." Charles stopped dead in his tracks. The smug relaxation from his Swiss vacation vanished instantly, replaced by a violently flushed purple rage. He dropped his leather overnight bag, the heavy thud echoing against the marble, and closed the distance between us in 3 long strides. He stopped mere inches from my face, thrusting a thick, manicured finger directly at my eyes. "How dare you speak to us like that?" Charles bellowed, his voice vibrating with a vicious, uncontrollable fury. "You are nothing but an ungrateful, pathetic failure. You have spent your entire life mooching off the sterling name, playing the martyr while we built the real wealth. I am the executor of this estate. I am the chief operating officer of the company. I am in charge. Get out of my house before I have security throw you onto the street." Beverly stepped up right beside him, her perfectly contoured face twisted into a mask of pure, aristocratic disgust. She did not even bother to pick up her fur coat. She kicked it aside, her eyes locked onto mine with absolute venom. "You have finally crossed the line," Fiona Beverly hissed, her voice dripping with ice. "We tolerated your lack of ambition. We tolerated your embarrassing little accounting job because it amused your grandfather to pretend you had potential. But this blatant disrespect is the end. I am cutting you off completely. You will not see a single cent of the family trust. You will not be invited to another holiday, another dinner, or another family event. You are entirely excised from this family. Pack your miserable little bags and leave." I listened to her threats and felt a dark, bitter amusement rising in my chest. She was threatening to cut me off from a trust fund I had never touched. She was threatening to banish me from family dinners where I was only ever invited to serve as a convenient target for their relentless ridicule. I remembered sitting at this very dining table 5 years ago when I landed my first major corporate audit. I had been so proud. I had brought a bottle of expensive champagne to celebrate. Beverly had poured the champagne down the kitchen sink, claiming it was too cheap to serve her guests, and then spent the entire evening loudly discussing Preston's entry-level promotion at Charles's firm. They had spent 3 decades meticulously trying to erase my worth. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I placed my delicate china teacup down on the mahogany side table with a soft, definitive clink. I stood up slowly, uncoiling from the high-backed leather armchair. For 30 years I had shrunk myself to fit into their presence. I had lowered my eyes, bitten my tongue, and swallowed my pride to keep the peace. I had made myself small so they could feel towering and grand. Not today. I squared my shoulders, rising to my full height. I let every ounce of the power I had secured that morning flow into my posture, projecting an absolute, unyielding dominance that made Charles physically falter and take a half step back. I did not raise my voice to match his screaming. I did not give them the satisfaction of an emotional outburst. Instead, I lowered my voice to a dangerous, razor-sharp whisper that sliced right through the heavy air of the grand foyer. "You cannot kick me out of a house you do not own, Charles." The words hung in the air, heavy and absolute. Charles blinked, his purple face momentarily going slack with sheer confusion. He opened his mouth to shout another insult, but the absolute certainty in my tone seemed to short-circuit his brain. He looked around the grand foyer as if expecting to see the walls suddenly change color. Preston scoffed loudly, breaking the heavy silence. He slammed his scotch glass down onto the bar cart, the crystal ringing sharply against the silver tray. "You are completely delusional," Preston sneered, shaking his head and marching aggressively across the room toward me. "You spend a few days reading to a dying man, and suddenly you think you own the place. You are out of your mind. We are done playing games with you, Fiona. You are leaving right now." He closed the distance rapidly, his face twisting into an ugly, familiar sneer. This was exactly how Preston had operated his entire life. When manipulation and money failed, he resorted to physical intimidation. I remembered being 16 years old, standing in the hallway of this exact house, blocking his way because he had stolen my architectural drafting supplies to use as kindling for the fire pit. He had simply shoved me hard against the wall, bruising my shoulder, and walked away laughing. He had never faced a single consequence for his cruelty. Preston lunged forward. He reached out with a heavy, aggressive hand, aiming to physically grab my arm and violently drag me toward the heavy oak front doors. I braced my legs, locking my stance and preparing to counter his assault. I was calculating the exact angle to strike his wrist when the entire dynamic of the room shifted in a fraction of a second. Before Preston's fingers could even brush the fabric of my sweater, a voice thundered through the cavernous space. It did not come from the living room. It came from high above us, echoing down the sweeping curve of the grand staircase. "Touch my granddaughter, Preston, and I will break your arm." Preston froze instantly, his hand suspended in midair. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified wax figure. Charles and Beverly whipped their heads around, their eyes wide with sudden, unadulterated terror. Standing at the very top of the grand staircase was Winston Sterling. He was not sitting in the motorized wheelchair they had ordered for him under the guise of failing mobility. He was not leaning heavily on the wooden cane Beverly had forced upon him, claiming he was a fall risk. He was standing perfectly straight, his broad shoulders squared, dressed in a sharp, immaculate three-piece charcoal suit. His silver hair was perfectly combed, his jaw was locked tight. His eyes, sharp and clear as cut glass, were blazing with a raw, terrifying fury that seemed to instantly drop the temperature in the room by 10 degrees. He did not look like a frail, confused old man waiting to be dragged away to a psychiatric ward. He looked like the untouchable titan of industry who had built a national logistics empire from the dirt up. He looked like a king who had just caught his subjects plotting a treasonous rebellion in his own throne room. Winston did not hesitate. He took a deliberate step forward, then another. He began walking down the grand staircase, his stride steady, powerful, and absolutely unassisted. Each footfall echoed against the marble steps, sounding like a judge's gavel slamming down to deliver a fatal sentence. Charles staggered backward, bumping into the antique console table. His mouth opened and closed silently, resembling a fish pulled onto dry land. Beverly clutched her designer handbag against her chest, as if it could somehow shield her from the terrifying reality descending the stairs. Dad Charles finally managed to croak his voice, a high-pitched whisper, entirely devoid of his previous arrogance. "What are you doing out of bed? Dr. Thorne said you needed to be resting. You are not well." Winston reached the bottom of the staircase and stepped onto the marble floor of the foyer. He did not look at Charles. He walked directly toward Preston, who was still standing awkwardly, with his hand raised near my arm. Winston stopped inches from Preston's face, towering over his grandson, with a quiet, lethal menace. "Lower your hand." Winston commanded, his voice a deep, rumbling growl that left absolutely no room for debate. Preston swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. He slowly lowered his arm, taking a quick shuffling step backward, to put distance between himself and the patriarch he thought he had successfully neutralized. "You are supposed to be incapacitated," Beverly blurted out, her shock overriding her normally calculated filter. "The medical report said you were experiencing severe cognitive decline. You shouldn't even be able to walk down those stairs without assistance." Winston finally turned his blazing eyes toward his daughter-in-law. The sheer contempt in his gaze made Beverly physically shrink backward. "The medical report was a fabricated lie," Winston stated, his voice cutting through the foyer like a freshly sharpened blade. "A lie you and my son paid Dr. Thorne a very generous consulting fee to write. A lie you intended to use to drag me out of this house today, lock me in a state-run psychiatric facility, and steal everything I spent my entire life building." The absolute silence that followed his words was deafening. The air in the room felt thick and heavy, loaded with the explosive tension of a bomb that had just been triggered. Charles's deep tan seemed to turn a sickly shade of gray. He looked at Beverly, then at Preston, and finally his panicked eyes locked onto me. He finally realized the depth of the trap they had just walked into. I stood beside Winston, my chin raised, my heart pounding with a fierce, triumphant rhythm. The scapegoat and the targeted patriarch standing shoulder to shoulder, ready to completely dismantle the people who had tried to destroy us. Winston turned back to Charles, his expression hardening into pure, unyielding stone. "Your timeline is officially canceled," Winston said softly. "Now you are going to answer to me." Charles stood frozen for a fraction of a second as his father's words echoed in the grand foyer. The deep, unnatural tan on his face seemed to curdle. He swallowed hard, his eyes darting from Winston's steady, unassisted stance to the hard set of his jaw. The realization that his father was not chemically subdued or mentally vacant should have sparked fear. But Charles possessed a bottomless reservoir of arrogance. He immediately fell back on the weapon he had been using for months. He attempted to manipulate reality. Charles forced his facial muscles to relax, painting on an expression of sickening manufactured sympathy. He took a slow, deliberate step toward his father, holding his hands up with his palms facing outward, treating the man who built an empire like a confused child. "Dad, please!" Charles cooed, his voice dripping with condescension. "You are having an episode. This is exactly what Dr. Thorne warned us about. The vascular dementia is causing severe paranoia and hallucinations. You are confused and you are lashing out. Let me help you upstairs to bed before you hurt yourself or say something you regret." Charles reached out, intending to grab Winston's arm and physically steer him away from the foyer. Winston did not move a single inch. He simply turned his gaze onto his son, and the temperature in the room plummeted. The look in Winston's eyes was so absolute, so devoid of paternal warmth, that Charles instinctively recoiled, his hand dropping back to his side. "Do not ever patronize me," Winston growled, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "And do not ever attempt to touch me again." Charles's face turned violently purple. The gentle, concerned facade vanished instantly, replaced by sheer, unadulterated rage. If he could not gaslight his father, he would attack the source of the rebellion. He whipped his head toward me, thrusting a manicured finger directly at my face. "You did this!" Charles screamed, the veins in his neck bulging against his expensive cashmere collar. "You filled his head with these absolute delusions. You are nothing but an ungrateful, pathetic failure. You have spent your entire life mooching off the sterling name, playing the tragic martyr while I ran the real business. I am the chief operating officer of this company. I am the executor of this estate. Get out of my house before I have private security throw you onto the freezing street." Beverly immediately stepped forward to flank her husband, her face twisted into a mask of pure aristocratic disgust. She pointed a perfectly manicured nail at my chest. "You have finally crossed the line," Fiona Beverly hissed, her voice vibrating with malice. "We tolerated your lack of ambition. We tolerated your embarrassing little accounting job because it amused your grandfather to pretend you had potential. But this blatant disrespect is the end. I am cutting you off completely. You will not see a single cent of the family trust. You will never be invited to another holiday, another dinner, or another family event. You are entirely excised from this family. Pack your miserable little bags and leave immediately. I listened to their threats and felt a dark, bitter amusement rising in my chest. They were threatening to banish me from family dinners, where I was only ever invited to serve as a convenient target for their relentless ridicule. I remembered sitting at this very dining table 5 years ago when I landed my first major corporate audit. I had brought a bottle of expensive champagne to celebrate. Beverly had poured the champagne down the kitchen sink, claiming it was too cheap to serve her guests, and then spent the entire evening loudly discussing Preston's entry-level promotion. They had spent 3 decades meticulously trying to erase my worth. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I placed my delicate china teacup down on the mahogany side table with a soft, definitive clink. I stood up slowly, uncoiling from the high-backed leather armchair. For 30 years I had shrunk myself to fit into their presence. I had lowered my eyes, bitten my tongue, and swallowed my pride to keep the peace. I had made myself small so they could feel towering and grand. Not today. I squared my shoulders, rising to my full height. I let every ounce of the power I had secured that morning flow into my posture, projecting an absolute unyielding dominance that made Charles physically falter. I did not raise my voice to match his hysterical screaming. I lowered it, forcing them to strain to hear the sound of their own destruction. "You cannot kick me out of a house you do not own, Charles." The word struck him like a physical blow. He staggered, his mouth opening and closing as his brain failed to process the sentence. I walked over to the heavy oak sideboard and picked up the massive leather-bound portfolio I had compiled over the last 72 hours. I walked back to the center of the room and dropped the enormous stack of documents directly onto the antique glass coffee table. The heavy thud echoed like a gunshot in the quiet room. "The charade is over," I stated, tapping the thick stack of paper. "I am a senior forensic auditor. I hunt financial parasites for a living, and you left a trail of digital blood a mile wide. I know exactly what you did." I pulled the first document from the top of the stack and tossed it across the glass toward Charles. "This is the $15 million Vanguard equity contract. You took out a massive balloon loan against the clean assets of Sterling Logistics. You used a fraudulent notary seal and a forged power of attorney to secure the capital." Charles stared at the paper, the deep tan draining from his face, leaving him a sickly ashen gray. I pulled the next stack of documents, slamming them down next to the first. "These are the routing numbers for the shell companies in Zurich. The exact offshore accounts you were visiting this week while pretending to be on a ski vacation. You have been systematically embezzling company funds and transferring them offshore to hide them from the IRS and your own father. You even set up a Cayman Islands dummy corporation to funnel regular kickbacks to Gregory Vance for his legal complicity." Beverly let out a strangled gasp. "You little liar! You fabricated these papers to steal our money. You have always been jealous of us." I turned my gaze to Beverly, pinning her in place. "Your money? Beverly, you haven't touched an honest dollar in 30 years. While you were hosting your pretentious country club galas and telling your wealthy friends that I was just a glorified human calculator, I was tracking the exact stolen funds you used to pay for your catered lunches. That white fur coat you just dropped on the floor, it was purchased using money embezzled directly from the Logistics Fleet Pension Fund. You stole from the blue-collar workers who built this company so you could play dress-up in the Swiss Alps." I did not give them a second to breathe. I pulled the final, most damning file from the portfolio. "And this is the correspondence between you two and Dr. Eris Thorne. I have every single email. I have the messages where Beverly complained about his exorbitant bribery fee. I have the messages where Charles explicitly ordered him to prescribe a maximum dosage of chemical restraints so Winston would be completely incapacitated during the extraction. You were going to lock a perfectly healthy, brilliant man inside a state-run psychiatric nightmare just to trigger the medical proxy. You were going to bury your own father alive to cover your $15 million debt. Preston was shaking. The scotch glass trembled in his hand, spilling amber liquid over his knuckles. He looked at the documents, then at Charles. Dad, tell her she is crazy. Tell her this is a lie. Charles could not speak. He was hyperventilating, his eyes darting frantically around the room, searching for an exit that did not exist. Preston looked back at me, the reality of the situation finally piercing his supreme arrogance. His entire life was built on this stolen foundation. The luxury cars, the endless credit cards, the unearned status, it was all vanishing into thin air. He was not a wealthy heir. He was the son of a federal criminal. You threw a $100 bill at my feet, I said to Preston, my voice dripping with absolute contempt. You mocked my boring life. That $100 was stolen directly from your grandfather's retirement trust. Your entire existence is a pathetic, fraudulent joke. Preston snapped. The smug, untouchable golden boy shattered into pure, violent desperation. You psychotic bitch, he screamed, dropping his glass. It shattered against the marble floor. I will ruin you. He lunged across the distance between us, throwing his entire body weight forward. He wasn't aiming for me. He was aiming for the coffee table. He reached out with both hands, his fingers clawing frantically at the stack of forensic audits and forged contracts, completely convinced that if he could just tear the physical papers to shreds, he could somehow erase the crimes. Before his hands could even graze the documents, a tall figure stepped smoothly out from the dark shadows of the adjacent study. Marcus Vance moved with the terrifying speed of a seasoned litigator who knew exactly how to handle hostile environments. He intercepted Preston's lunge, catching the younger man's wrist in a vice-like grip. With a sharp, practiced twist, Marcus forced Preston's arm behind his back, halting his momentum instantly and pinning him awkwardly against the edge of the heavy sofa. Preston cried out in pain, struggling helplessly against the attorney's iron grip. Marcus did not raise his voice. He looked down at Preston with an expression of profound professional boredom. I strongly advise against destroying that paperwork, Preston. Marcus stated, his tone chillingly casual. Those are merely the presentation copies. Multiple encrypted digital versions of those documents are already in federal custody. Preston thrashed for a fraction of a second longer before the chilling reality of Marcus Vance's words and the absolute physical superiority of his grip registered. Preston went entirely limp, letting out a pathetic, breathy whine as Marcus effortlessly released his wrist and shoved him backward. Preston stumbled and collapsed onto the heavy velvet sofa, clutching his arm and staring at the attorney with wide, terrified eyes. Charles stood paralyzed, his jaw practically unhinged. The presence of the family's most ruthless and expensive corporate attorney, emerging from the shadows of their own study, meant this was not a spontaneous argument. It was not a temper tantrum from an ungrateful niece. It was a meticulously executed, legally binding ambush. The deep European tan on Charles's face completely evaporated, leaving behind a sickly, pallid gray mask of sheer panic. He looked from Marcus to Winston, and then finally back to me, his eyes darting frantically as his brain struggled to process the total collapse of his reality. Charles swallowed hard and attempted to salvage his shattered authority. He forced a trembling, strained laugh that sounded like dry leaves scraping across concrete. This is absurd, Charles stammered, pointing a shaking finger at Marcus. You cannot legally retain those documents. My father is suffering from documented vascular dementia. He is medically unfit to authorize any financial audits or legal inquiries. Dr. Thorne has already submitted the preliminary paperwork for a full medical proxy. Whatever Fiona coerced him into doing is entirely invalid. We will have this thrown out of court by Monday morning. Marcus adjusted the cuffs of his tailored suit jacket with maddening slowness. He did not even look at Charles when he spoke. Dr. Thorne is currently sitting in an interrogation room at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Marcus stated, his voice a smooth, monotone hum. He surrendered his medical license yesterday afternoon, in exchange for a plea deal regarding his involvement in your fraudulent psychiatric diagnostic ring. Furthermore, Winston underwent 3 independent comprehensive neurological evaluations this week, conducted by the top cognitive specialists at Johns Hopkins. They unanimously certified that his mental acuity is exceptionally sharp. Your medical proxy is a worthless piece of forged paper, Charles. Charles physically recoiled as if Marcus had struck him across the face. He stumbled backward, his legs hitting the edge of the antique console table. He had no more lies to spin. He had no more manipulation tactics to deploy. The illusion of his supreme control was completely eradicated. I walked over to the heavy oak sideboard and picked up a sleek black leather folder. Winston stood silently beside the roaring fireplace, radiating an immovable, unyielding pride. He did not need to speak. He had given me the sword, and it was my turn to swing it. I walked back to the center of the room and pulled a single stack of crisp, watermarked pages from the black folder. While you were busy drinking vintage champagne in Zurich and finalizing your offshore embezzlement accounts, I said, my voice ringing with absolute authority, Grandfather and I were conducting real business. I dropped the document onto the glass coffee table right next to the damning forensic audits. This is an irrevocable trust and complete transfer of ownership, I announced, staring directly into Charles's panicked eyes. As of 8 o'clock yesterday morning, Winston officially stepped down from all active corporate and personal financial holdings. He transferred 100% of the Sterling estate, the residential properties, the liquid assets, and 68% of the majority shareholder voting rights directly into my name. Preston let out a strangled gasp from the sofa. You are lying. He wouldn't do that. He wouldn't give everything to you. I ignored Preston, keeping my gaze locked on Charles. I am the sole owner of this estate, Charles. I am the absolute majority shareholder. And as the new acting chief executive officer of Sterling Logistics, my very first official act is corporate restructuring. Charles shook his head violently, his hands trembling at his sides. You cannot do this, Fiona. I built the modern infrastructure of this company. I am the chief operating officer. You cannot just erase me. I am not erasing you, Charles, I replied, my tone dropping to a deadly whisper. I am firing you. You are terminated effective immediately. And Preston, your fictitious position as Vice President of Regional Acquisitions is permanently dissolved. You are both fired. The words hung in the air, heavy and absolute. I watched the realization sink into their bones. I did not give them a single second to catch their breath. I systematically dismantled their entire existence. Your corporate access keycards were deactivated 10 minutes before you walked through that front door. I continued delivering the blows with surgical precision. Your company issued cell phones and laptops are currently being wiped remotely by our cybersecurity department. Your inflated salaries, your limitless expense accounts, your premium health benefits, and your access to the corporate jet fleet are permanently revoked. Preston leaped up from the sofa, his face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. You can't take my cards, he screamed, his voice cracking. How am I supposed to pay for anything? My apartment, my car lease, my life is tied to those accounts. You should have thought about your car lease before you decided to steal from the pension fund of the workers who actually earned that money. I snapped back, silencing him instantly. Charles lunged forward, his fists clenched at his sides. I will sue you into oblivion, Fiona. I will drag you and this senile old man through a decade of litigation. I will tie this company up in so much legal red tape, it will bleed dry before you ever see a single dime of profit. If you attempt to file a single lawsuit, Charles Verscher said, stepping directly into his personal space, forcing him to look down at me, Marcus will submit the full unredacted forensic audit to the Securities and Exchange Commission before your lawyer can even draft the header. We will hand over the routing numbers, the fake loan contracts, and the evidence of your conspiracy to falsely imprison a healthy man. You are walking out of here with absolutely nothing, because nothing is exactly what you have earned. If you fight me, you will spend the rest of your natural life in a federal penitentiary. Charles's mouth snapped shut. The threat of prison finally extinguished the last dying embers of his arrogance. He looked at the floor, a broken, pathetic shell of the tyrant who had walked in 10 minutes earlier. Beverly watched her husband and son get completely decimated. She looked at the towering stack of documents on the coffee table, then at Marcus, then at Winston, and finally, her eyes locked onto me. The catastrophic reality of the situation crashed down upon her. The exclusive country club memberships, the luxury European vacations, the designer wardrobes, the sprawling estates, it was all gone. She was instantly stripped of the wealth that defined her entire toxic identity. Beverly immediately shifted tactics. The haughty, aristocratic disgust vanished from her face. Her perfectly contoured features crumpled into a mask of desperate, manufactured sorrow. She covered her mouth, letting out a loud, dramatic sob. She took a step toward me, holding her hands out as if reaching for a lifeline. "Fiona, darling, please," Beverly cried, her voice trembling with a sickeningly sweet, fake vulnerability. "You are so upset. We have all made terrible mistakes. Tensions have been high. But you cannot destroy us like this. We are your family. We love you, Fiona. We have always wanted the best for you. Please just put these papers away, and we can sit down and talk about this. We can fix this together like a family." I did not move. I did not soften. I looked at Beverly with an absolute freezing calm that made her outstretched hands falter. "You love me?" I asked, my voice echoing through the grand foyer like a gavel striking a block of solid ice. "You loved me when I sat at your kitchen table begging you to help me pay for my advanced accounting degree, and you looked me in the eye and swore there was no money left in the educational trust. I spent the next year working double shifts waiting tables until my feet bled just to make tuition. 3 days after you denied me, you bought Preston a brand new custom Porsche for his 21st birthday using that exact educational trust fund." Beverly dropped her hands, the fake tears stopping instantly as her jaw tightened in defensive panic. She opened her mouth to make an excuse, but I cut her off. "You loved me?" I continued, taking a slow, deliberate step toward her when I graduated at the absolute top of my university class. I sat in a crowded auditorium, looking at 6 empty seats that you explicitly promised to fill. You abandoned me on the most important day of my life because you decided you desperately needed to attend a last-minute luxury spa retreat in Sedona. You left me completely alone so you could get a hot stone massage. I pointed a steady finger toward Winston, who was watching the dismantling of his daughter-in-law with grim satisfaction. "And your profound familial love culminated today, Beverly," I said, my voice ringing with unmistakable finality. "You colluded to lock a brilliant, perfectly healthy man inside a psychiatric ward, just so you could steal his legacy and cover up your own criminal greed. You smiled while you plotted to bury him alive." I stared directly into her terrified eyes, delivering the absolute final blow. "You stole my college fund to buy Preston a Porsche. You abandoned me at graduation. You tried to lock Grandpa in a ward to steal his legacy. We share DNA, Beverly. We are not family." A profound, heavy silence fell over the grand foyer. Charles, Beverly, and Preston stood frozen, completely stripped of their wealth, their power, and their delusions. They had absolutely nothing left to say. Then the silence was violently shattered. Brilliant flashing red and blue lights suddenly pierced the sheer curtains of the living room windows, painting the pale walls in frantic spinning colors. The heavy crunch of gravel echoed from the circular driveway outside. A second later, a series of loud, aggressive knocks hammered against the heavy oak double doors of the grand foyer, echoing through the house like thunder. The heavy, aggressive knocking rattled the antique hinges of the double doors. Charles flinched as if he had been physically struck. Preston whimpered, rubbing his wrist where Marcus had released him. Beverly stared at the flashing red and blue lights painting the sheer curtains, completely unable to process that her meticulously crafted reality was collapsing. Marcus Vance smoothed his silk tie and walked calmly across the marble foyer. He reached out and pulled open the heavy oak doors. A blast of freezing Chicago wind swept into the house, carrying with it the sharp, chaotic crackle of police radios. It was not Dr. Thorne. It was not the private medical transport contractors hired to quietly drag my grandfather into a chemically induced exile. A team of federal agents stepped over the threshold, their dark windbreakers a stark contrast to the pristine white foyer. They moved with absolute terrifying purpose, bypassing the scattered luxury shopping bags and stepping directly toward Charles and Preston. Charles Sterling, a stern-faced agent, announced, his voice carrying the immovable weight of federal authority. "You are under arrest. You are being charged with multiple counts of wire fraud, corporate embezzlement forgery, and elder financial abuse." Charles backed away, his hands raised in a pathetic gesture of surrender. "There is a misunderstanding," he stammered, his voice cracking into a high-pitched squeak. "I am the Chief Operating Officer of Sterling Logistics. I need to call my corporate counsel." "You cannot do this." "You do not have corporate counsel anymore," Charles Marcus stated, stepping aside to let the agents pass. "You were just terminated." The agents moved in seamlessly. They grabbed Charles by his tailored cashmere sleeves, forcing his arms behind his back. The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs echoing through the grand space was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. Charles collapsed in on himself, his legs giving out as the agents practically had to drag his dead weight toward the door. Preston did not even try to run. He fell to his knees on the Persian rug, openly sobbing. He begged the agents, claiming he just did what his father told him to do. He pointed a shaking finger at Charles, attempting to trade his own flesh and blood for leniency, but the agents ignored his crying. They hauled Preston to his feet, slapping the cuffs tightly around his wrists, and marching him out into the freezing slush alongside his father. Beverly was left standing alone in the center of the foyer, completely paralyzed. The agents did not arrest her. She was not the architect of the corporate fraud, merely the parasitic beneficiary who happily spent the stolen millions. But as she watched her husband and son being shoved into the back of federal vehicles, the reality of her survival hit her. "My money," Beverly gasped, clutching her designer handbag. "My accounts, my credit cards." "Frozen," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. "The feds seized everything tied to Charles and Preston 30 minutes ago. You have absolutely nothing." Beverly let out a horrific, piercing shriek. She scrambled wildly, gathering her glossy Prada and Moncler shopping bags, as if the luxury cardboard could somehow shield her from poverty. She stumbled backward in her panic, slipping on the wet floor and tumbling out the front doors onto the icy driveway. She sat in the freezing slush, surrounded by her useless, expensive bags, screaming at the federal vehicles rolling down the street. I walked slowly to the threshold. Beverly looked up at me, her makeup running down her face, her aristocratic pride completely shattered. "Fiona, please," she sobbed, extending a shaking hand toward the warmth of the foyer. I looked down at the woman who had spent my entire life making me feel invisible. I did not feel pity. I did not feel anger. I felt absolutely nothing. I reached out, grabbed the heavy brass handle of the oak door, and calmly pulled it shut. The heavy lock engaged with a deep, satisfying thud, completely shutting out the noise of her screaming and sealing her in the cold. 3 months later, the oppressive Chicago winter broke, giving way to a brilliant, blooming spring. The destruction of the people who had tried to bury us was absolute and highly publicized. Charles and Preston were denied bail, deemed flight risks due to their offshore shell companies. They were currently sitting in a federal detention center facing decades in prison, while they turned on each other in desperate attempts to secure a plea deal. Beverly was instantly ostracized. The high society friends she had spent decades cultivating immediately blocked her phone number the moment the scandal hit the news. Bankrupt and completely cut off from the Sterling estate, she had been forced to move into a tiny studio apartment. The woman who once poured expensive champagne down the sink because it offended her, Pallet, was now working a minimum-wage retail job, folding sweaters at a discount mall, just to pay for her groceries. I sat on the sprawling stone patio of the estate, letting the warm spring sunshine wash over me. The air smelled of blooming lilac and fresh-cut grass. I rested my pen on the glass table and looked over the highly successful quarterly report for Sterling Logistics. Under my leadership, the company had been thoroughly sanitized. The toxic debts were cleared, the stolen pension funds were fully restored, and our profit margins were climbing higher than they had in a decade. Winston sat in the cushioned wicker chair beside me, looking healthier and more vibrant than he had in years. He was not gripping a cane, he was not confined to a wheelchair. He reached over and picked up a tall glass of iced tea, the ice cubes clinking softly against the crystal. He took a slow sip and turned to me, a deep, warm smile crinkling the corners of his sharp, clear eyes. He looked at the brilliant granddaughter he finally saw clearly, the woman who had fought a war for him and won. You know, Fiona, Winston said, his deep voice rumbling with quiet joy. Having you babysit me was the greatest decision they ever made. I smiled, picking up my own glass. I looked out over the sprawling green lawn, feeling the absolute peace of a life finally built on my own terms. I raised my glass toward him. It really was, Grandpa, I said, clinking my glass gently against his. It really was. The dramatic unraveling of the Sterling family teaches us a profound lesson about the dangerous illusion of ego and the quiet, undeniable strength of the overlooked. For years, Charles, Beverly, and Preston operated under the fatal misconception that wealth, status, and cruelty equated to untouchable power. They mistook Fiona's patience for passivity and her silence for submission. They believed that because they could shout the loudest and spend the most, they held all the control. However, true power rarely needs to scream. While her family was busy building a fragile house of cards on a foundation of deceit, embezzlement, and unearned entitlement, Fiona was meticulously building a fortress of undeniable truth. The antagonists ultimately dug their own graves with their greed, proving that manipulation and gaslighting can only sustain you until the hard facts are laid bare in the light of day. Furthermore, this story boldly redefines the true meaning of kinship. We are often conditioned to believe that sharing DNA demands endless loyalty, even in the face of continuous abuse and disrespect. Fiona and Winston's ultimate triumph shatters that toxic narrative. They proved that a true family is built on a foundation of mutual respect, fierce protection, and unyielding integrity, not just bloodlines. By systematically severing ties with those who only sought to exploit them, they didn't just save their financial legacy, they secured their peace. The ultimate takeaway: never underestimate the person you constantly force into the shadows. The very crucible of isolation and humiliation you put them through might just be the fire that forges their unbreakable steel. Have you ever had to stand your ground against toxic individuals who severely underestimated your worth? Have you ever had to completely redefine what family means to protect your own peace and future? Share your story of resilience in the comments below. Your journey might be the exact inspiration someone else desperately needs to hear today. If this story of ultimate justice resonated with you, hit that like button and subscribe for more incredible stories of triumph and standing your ground.